In Virginia, Candice Martinez finds her place in the world in the arms of her college sweetheart.
Candice and Dave were inseparable. You saw one, you saw the other.
But when the teenagers run low on cash, Candice risks it all for love and becomes one of the nation's most well-known fugitives.
It was bold, brazen, it was unlike anything we'd ever seen.
She would have done just about anything for him because that's the only relationship she's really ever had.
And later, in Florida, Genet Rembert is a lost soul, working the streets, until she falls for a charming man with a dangerous proposal.
She had no one to turn to. He gave her what she thought was love.
Whenever he would snap her fingers, she would do whatever he said.
They treated these women no better than caged animals.
Candice Martinez's childhood stands in stark contrast to the vibrant tourist mecca of Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Candice really never had a chance. From the time she was born, she was a child, unfortunately, surrounded by neglect.
After her parents' divorce when she's 5, Candice bounces between a drug-addicted mother and an abusive father. By age 12, she drops out of school and spends most of her time on the street.
She was constantly in a state of change. Candice felt like she was alone in the world and she had to fend for herself.
Candice began drinking, using pills, using drugs, 12 years old, running the streets of Santa Fe.
Despite being on the streets, Candice knew that this wasn't the life that she really wanted and was smart enough to know that she needed to break that cycle.
Then one day, she finds a light at the end of the tunnel.
She saw a commercial for a famous home for wayward children in Nebraska.
With the help of a social worker, Candice moves 1,000 miles away from her broken life in New Mexico. And for the next 5 years, she thrives. She even graduates high school and at 18 years old enrolls in college. But just as everything seems to be going her way, her life takes a sinister turn.
She meets a guy, and this guy was abusive toward her, and this sent her in a spiral back into her old ways, and she didn't even complete her freshman year.
Candice was not prepared for life. She did not have those skills. When you don't have those skills, you do the best thing. You run away.
So she dropped out of school. She went right back to her bad lifestyle. Drugs, running the streets, partying, disappearing for weeks on end.
Part of this is because she was really never given the tools to cope with adversity, and the other part was this was something that she knew.
But the troubled 19-year-old gets a second chance at life when a cousin from the Washington, D.C. suburb of Burke, Virginia, invites her to come out east and live with her.
She offered her a way out, to get your life together, go to school, get back on the right track.
Candice felt excited about the opportunity to once again start over. She felt like she could make a new her.
She packs up and heads to Virginia. Within just a few months, things are already looking up.
She got to work on remaking her life again. She got a job selling memberships at a gym.
She enrolled in the local community college. She was working on a degree in technology, radiological technology.
It might look like her days of making bad decisions are over, but they have just begun. That fall, while studying on campus, Candice eyes an attractive fellow student, 19-year-old Dave Williams.
He was handsome. He had a beautiful smile, long braids. Candice was definitely attracted.
Never one to be bashful with men, she prances over to him and strikes up a conversation.
Her pickup line was, "I like your hair, can you braid my hair like that?" And Dave thought that was pretty cool, and they began talking.
It's a brief encounter, but Candice is intrigued. The two exchange numbers and start to talk regularly. She can tell right away that Dave is different than the other guys she's dated.
He's an average guy. He shows her respect. He's nice to her. He's kind. He's courteous.
He didn't drink and he didn't do drugs. Dave seemed like just your standard suburban good kid.
He tells her he's studying engineering and admits that he's a bit of a mama's boy.
His parents had divorced, but they lived very close to each other, and Dave lived with both of them. Mainly he lived with his mother. He relied heavily on his mother.
He had a promising future ahead of him, and the icing on the cake was that he wanted her. He was all about her.
She can't believe how lucky she is. After only a few weeks of dating, the college freshmen spend every free moment together.
They were inseparable. They were actually infatuated with each other. It happened so fast.
But before these young lovers can ride off into the sunset, Dave gets some troubling news. His father, an assistant financial controller at a resort, is arrested for embezzlement and sent to jail for almost a year. Dave is devastated.
Dave's home life, which had been a solid rock for many years, was suddenly crumbling.
Candice does her best to be there for her boyfriend.
Why don't we move in together?
She thought that the best way for Dave to get out of this rut, this depression, was for them to move in together. They could be together 24/7. They could be happy.
After only a month of dating, the college couple gets an apartment in Chantilly, Virginia, 15 miles west of Burke. But soon realize they've bitten off more than they can chew.
They had no financial skills. If you rent a place, you have to pay the rent in a timely fashion every month. You have to sometimes pay the electricity, you have to pay the gas, you have to pay the water.
They virtually had no money. Dave didn't have a job. He was depressed about his family situation, and her job just wasn't paying enough for the bills.
Both Dave and Candice were young, they were naive, and bills were starting to pile up. They didn't know how to handle their finances. Money was running thin, and they were getting desperate.
That's when the good guy comes up with a dangerous solution to their problems.
He felt like his world was collapsing and that he needed to come up with a quick way to give them some financial solvency.
What's he gonna do?
Should we rob the bank?
He came up with a plan to get them some money fast.
They were crazy in love. She would have done anything for him.
In Chantilly, Virginia, Candice Martinez's college boyfriend, Dave Williams, comes up with a crazy plan for the young lovers to pay the bills.
So instead of like normal people and getting another job and finding a legal way of paying the rent, Dave suggested that they rob a bank.
At first, the 19-year-old thinks he's joking, but quickly realizes her man is dead serious.
Dave had worked in a bank before, and he knew how bank tellers worked. He made it clear to her how they could pull this off.
The former teller wants to hit his old bank, just 20 minutes away in Vienna, Virginia.
This was one where he had familiarity and was able to convey to Candice that there's a certain comfort level in terms of knowing who's in there, where the tellers are, how the security is set up.
She knows that if she's not down with the plan, she might risk losing the love of her life.
She had never had such a stable figure in her life as Dave was, and at this point she wanted to preserve the relationship, and so she was willing to do anything that it took, even going along with this crazy idea of robbing a bank to keep that relationship alive.
Let's do this. Come on, let's rob a bank. Okay, get it. And how much money do you think?
Excited, the two college students pull an all-nighter, but instead of cramming for exams, they prepare for their first ever bank heist.
They got on the computer and they typed up a note and printed it out. They cut it up and they put it on the front side of a shoebox so that the shoebox could be used to collect the money.
This was carefully planned out. He wanted to make sure that she felt secure.
The only snag is that if Dave sets foot in the bank, his former co-workers might recognize him.
So Candice sort of volunteered that she would do it.
I can do that. It's easy.
She agrees to fly solo inside the bank.
She wouldn't have to say anything. She could just hand the note over on the box and take the note back, not leaving any evidence.
And her boyfriend is confident that the teller will hand the cash right over. But in case anything goes wrong, he'll be right outside in the getaway car.
Dave told Candice it would be like stealing candy from a baby.
1 week later, the couple makes their move.
It was the middle of the day. They pull up to this bank. They're both in the car. It's really tense.
So Dave was worried. He wasn't going into the bank. Candice was going into the bank. So he had an idea, which was have her be on the cell phone. The two of them could be in constant contact during the robbery.
Candice grabs her cell, gives her man a quick kiss, and then casually gets out of the car. Dave keeps the engine running.
And so, before she went in for the robbery, he called her, and they were on the phone, and she is talking on the phone as she walks into the bank, carrying the box with the note on the front.
Despite all of their preparation, there's one precaution they didn't take.
There was no covering of Candice's face. They hadn't planned for that. They just were immature.
She felt that I'm nondescript anyway. I'm just a little Latin girl, and I'm like all the rest. No one will point me out. We all look alike.
The bold young woman enters the bank, holds the shoebox in one hand, and talks with Dave on her cell phone in the other.
Her entrance was excellent because it did not attract attention.
She looked like an average person making a deposit or dropping something off. No one would suspect that she was robbing this bank.
She does her best to avoid the cameras and approaches the first teller. Candice smiles and slides the box towards the teller, casually chatting with Dave all the while.
The note wanted $70,000, and it instructed the teller to hand it over, and that the robber had a gun, and that either the teller or the person next to the teller would get shot if the money wasn't handed over.
Terrified, the woman does as instructed.
The teller put as much money as she could into the box, as quickly as she could.
In the minutes that it took for Candice to rob this bank, the teller put in $14,480 in this shoebox.
Once outside, she walks briskly to the car, careful not to draw attention. The couple speeds off, elated at what they just did. Candice is amazed at how easy it is to pull off a bank robbery.
No police, no chases, no one got hurt, and they got a substantial amounts of money. So I'm sure they thought they hit payday.
To celebrate, the couple goes on a shopping spree.
All they could think of was spend, spend, spend. They spent it on designer purses, a car, TVs, electronics.
In just a week, thanks to their now lavish lifestyle, they quickly burn through their cash. But they have a foolproof way to solve that problem.
They decided to rob another bank.
Once Candice succeeded in the Vienna bank robbery, this improved her self-esteem, gave her some real power, and it made her feel much more valuable to be in this relationship with David.
Just 9 days after their first robbery, while authorities are trying to figure out who the mysterious robber is, the couple hits a bank from the same chain, 7 miles south in Manassas, Virginia.
The MO was the same. Dave was the getaway car guy, the same note, in the same box.
But this time, the bank robbing lovers are disappointed with the haul.
They got, I think, $3,200 out of that. Wasn't a big hit. Gotten $14,000 before, so they quickly decided to do another robbery.
The very next day, they strike again. This time, a bank 20 miles east in Springfield, and things are much more tense.
The teller was really slow. She was nervous. She was afraid. And Candice got more bold and cocky.
Candice said, "Speed it up."
Speed it up, or someone's gonna get hurt.
The teller puts the money in the box. They get about $6,000 from this robbery, and Candice escapes.
Because they didn't get as much money as they wanted to in the last robbery, they know that they really need to step it up. And by doing this, she's feeling stronger, more accomplished, braver.
Candice doesn't hide her identity during any of the robberies. And lucky for her, any images the bank cameras happen to capture are useless.
The banks had not gotten a good image of her. The technology of surveillance cameras in banks was not great.
All the authorities have to go on is a vague description of the brash bank robber. With 3 heists in 3 weeks, they're on a roll and hungry for more, so the young lovers plan their next move. But Dave wants to up the ante. He hands Candice a .38 caliber revolver.
This time they really went for a big hit, and somebody was going to get hurt.
And later, in Hollywood, Florida, Genet Rembert learns that following your heart can have dire consequences.
McKinley had a power over Genet. All she cared about was him and what he wanted.
He gave her what she
The teller that Candice robbed in their second robbery was traumatized.
She lost sleep, she had flashbacks, she didn't trust anyone. The emotional scars will always be with those tellers because they were scared for their life.
In Northern Virginia, after successfully robbing 3 banks in 3 weeks, Candice Martinez and her boyfriend Dave Williams are not about to slow down. And the young lovers look to raise the stakes.
This time, Dave gave Candice a gun, a .38. He apparently borrowed the gun from his stepdad, not telling the stepdad what he was going to be using it for.
He gave her a gun because if she had one, the tellers would probably respond faster, give her more money.
Just a week after their last robbery, one afternoon the outlaw lovers drive 20 minutes to a bank in Ashburn, Virginia. While Dave idles by the entrance, she saunters into the bank, gun tucked away in her purse, cell phone to her ear, and a shoebox in her hand.
She walks up to the counter, she puts her purse on there. She slowly pulls out a gun just a little bit to show the teller, just enough so that the teller knew she meant business.
Afraid for her life, the teller quickly does as she's told. With the box now overflowing with cash, Candice hops in the car with her man, and the two take off.
This time, they hit it big. She walked out with nearly $25,000.
It's another perfect bank robbery, but their luck might have finally run out.
What she didn't know was this time, the camera up behind the teller was getting a good picture of her.
So this particular bank had a more advanced security system. So the bank surveillance actually captured her face in full detail.
The cameras not only took a picture of her, but the outside was able to capture the car.
With this new evidence, local authorities team up with the FBI to hunt down this mystery female who's brazenly robbing banks. They send the latest bank surveillance footage of Candice and the getaway car to every television channel in the U.S.
Suddenly the news media catch on to this. This woman has been robbing these banks while using a cell phone, and we called her the cell phone bandit. The fact that there was video footage sent the story careening around the world.
Despite their brand new widescreen TV, Dave and Candice have no clue that federal agents are hot on their trail.
They were living in this Bonnie and Clyde fantasy world. They didn't know that they were plastered all over the 24-hour news cycle.
But only a few days after their 4th robbery, reality sets in. Dave's mother calls him after seeing Candice on the news, and he panics.
He'd been a good boy, he'd been a law-abiding guy, and he realized suddenly something clicked that he needed to get back on the right track.
1 week after their 4th and final robbery, Dave turns himself in to the Fairfax County Police Station.
You're dealing with a young person. You're not dealing with a hardened criminal. The gig was up. The game is over.
And he immediately gives up Candice.
He flipped without hesitation and told them that it was his girlfriend. So the FBI and the police begin to stake out their apartment. Eventually, Candice shows up and she's arrested.
Realizing there's no way out, she comes clean. But like Dave, she doesn't hesitate to turn on her lover, saying it was all Dave's idea.
We robbed a bank. They were both charged with conspiracy to commit bank robbery and use of a firearm, which adds 5 years to any other crime.
They both plead guilty to the charges and are sentenced to 12 years without parole.
They're ordered to give back all the stuff that they had bought, but also to pay back the cash that they'd stolen from the banks. When they walk out of prison, they are responsible for repaying around $43,000.
For Candice, while she doesn't blame Dave for her choices, she regrets ever being involved in the robberies.
Candice was extremely remorseful. She knew that she had had this brilliant second chance at life. She had escaped Santa Fe for a second time, and she blew it.
Blinded by love, she now has to face the harsh consequences of everything she gave up for just under $50,000.
She was the face of the robberies. She had the most to lose. She risked it all because of her love for Dave. She risked her freedom, her livelihood, her family.
Candice so desperately wanted someone to love her, and she cared more about Dave and that relationship than she cared about herself, even though at the end of all of it, she completely lost her freedom. She lost 12 years of her life.
Candice Martinez cashed in her good sense so she could live a fairy tale life with her college sweetheart. In Hollywood, Florida, Genet Rembert desperately clings to a man who has a warped way of expressing his love. Growing up in Miami, Florida, Genet Rembert never knew what it was like to be part of a loving family.
She was one of 4 children that her mother had with 4 different men. Some of the other children lived with foster parents or with grandparents.
She was the cutest little girl. She had the widest smile. Like, behind that smile, my sister was really sad, and she was living a very hard life.
She's never even set eyes on her dad, and her mother is not the best caretaker, to say the least.
Genet wasn't fed or taken care of a lot. She would go to school and smell like urine and had to get sent home because she wasn't dressed properly.
At 6 years old, social services finally steps in, citing neglect. She's removed from her mother's care. As the years go by, the young girl bounces from foster homes to family members. At the young age of 15, she runs away to take her chances on the streets.
She just felt so unloved. She felt like, you know, she had no one to turn to. So that's when she ran away in search of love.
She was just running away from that profound pain that she felt as a little girl. And she was just looking for a place, some place, where she felt she truly belonged.
For the next 3 years, the troubled teen floats around the city, honing her self-destructive behavior.
She became a whole different person. She started doing really bad things.
She has no parental supervision around, has no family dynamics to keep her safe. So they end up consorting with people that are less law-abiding.
She did not have a job. She wasn't in school. She's sleeping over here on this couch. She's sleeping over here on that couch. She's using drugs.
To fund her drug habit, Genet sells the only thing she can, her body.
She starts prostituting for money, but she made the decision that that lifestyle was working for her, and that's what she did.
By the young age of 18, her life is in a downward spiral, and when it looks like things can't get much worse, she meets a charismatic man with a sadistic side.
He was her whole world. Her boss, her daddy, her lover, all combined together.
He would snap his fingers and she would jump.
Miami, Florida. After years of running wild on the streets, 18-year-old Genet Rembert spends her days prostituting for drugs.
And I wouldn't say necessarily there's a reason why she did it, but that's just what she chose to do at the time. I was so worried about her. She felt like no one really loved her.
Genet was abandoned very early in her life, and therefore she started to develop this me against the world mentality. But all of that was a mask for what she truly felt, which was that she was alone.
And she is living pillar to post, sleeping here, sleeping there, using drugs, not connected to anything of real value. So one day, she's out looking for dope.
That's when friends tell her about a Haitian-born dealer, 31-year-old McKinley Desir. He's a one-stop shop to get your fix. Genet tracks him down in the parking lot of a local motel. She tells him she's looking to score cocaine and flashes some cash she earned turning tricks. But McKinley takes one look at her and says he has another payment plan in mind.
I want some more than your money.
He was a very nice-looking young man who knew how to talk to young women. He knew what to say. He knew how to say it. He was very effective.
McKinley had two sides to him. One, the personable side you would see when you first met him, and then after a while you would see the business side of him.
The wayward teenager has just unknowingly wandered into the trap of the ultimate street predator, a true hustler who slings drugs, and pimps on the side.
He preyed on people who were insecure or didn't have a home or were looking for love.
And right away he sees that Genet is just his type.
He could see the need and the loss and the abandonment in her. It was probably in her eyes.
They drive 20 miles north to Hollywood, Florida, where he lives in a 2-bedroom apartment. Desperate to get high, and no stranger to selling her body, she agrees to swap sex for the drugs. The smooth Haitian shows her a tenderness she's never experienced. Afterward, McKinley makes his new girl a proposition she can't refuse.
McKinley invited Genet to live with him so she could have a household to live in, something that she didn't have before.
To the fix you need, look out for you.
He's promising her all the drugs that she might need. He's good looking. He's got a nice car. He's saying all the right things.
The lost teenager can't believe her luck.
Genet was damaged emotionally. McKinley gave her this false sense of feeling secure, that everything would be okay. And she came to call him daddy. And that's very symbolic because she never truly had her father in her life.
She was all in. She felt like she was going to finally be at home and somebody was going to love her.
She moves in, but McKinley makes it clear she must earn her keep.
And all she had to do was to sell her body, make some money.
She doesn't hesitate and does whatever he asks of her. Before long, McKinley becomes more to Genet than just her pimp.
She fell in love with him. He saw that she's a prophet and that he can put more money in his pocket.
It's quite possible that she really did love him, but perhaps this was some sort of a Stockholm syndrome where a person who has the power of life and death over you, you see this person as a god, and you mistake whatever moments of kindness as they're perhaps caring about you, but they really don't.
Pretty soon, the silver-tongued hustler realizes that this girl is different.
It's not a bad idea.
She's very intelligent and she's a go-getter. And McKinley saw that. McKinley saw that this is a woman that is business-minded, she's smart, and she's gonna make me money.
After just a few months, he gives his best girl even more responsibility. He promotes her to be his right-hand woman, the enforcer, someone to help him keep his stable of women in line. And she takes her new job as serious as the boss.
Come on,
He took that lifestyle that she enjoyed and took it up 10 notches.
She was a monster, the monster that he had wanted her to become.
In Hollywood, Florida, Genet Rembert finally feels like she's part of a family after her new pimp, McKinley Daddy Desir, promotes her.
She looked after the girls, explaining to them what they would need to be doing. It was her job to make sure that the girls gave the money and everything they received, and she would keep control of them.
I'll be watching you.
For the first time in her life, she felt like she was a part of something.
She jumps into her new job with both feet and proves herself right away, devising a way to drum up new business.
She created an email address and used that email address to create an account on the social bulletin board. Now, after Genet sets up the site, he would use her to take pictures of girls and post them for escort services.
Pretty soon, business is booming.
So Genet would get a response to her posting. You know, so the guy's looking for a date with these girls. She was in control of where the meet was going to be, or when the time was going to be.
But McKinley's stable of working girls aren't exactly willing recruits. Like Genet, most are addicts he lured in with the deadly combination of a free high and false hope.
He promised these girls a better life. He promised them that they'll have clothes, money, stability, things that they probably didn't have or that they looked forward to.
But then after the carrot comes the stick.
As soon as they grew comfort, he would pull them back and say, okay, time for you to go to work.
We need this.
To keep his girls in the family, the self-proclaimed daddy takes no chances.
He would keep the clothing for the girls, their phones, any of their personal articles in his house where he had control of them.
He padlocks the women in an efficiency attached to his apartment so they can't escape.
And then he would take them around to whatever motels or areas for these girls to have sex.
He keeps his girls docile with pills and crack cocaine. The only time they see the light of day is when he forces them to go to work.
The women, they were sleeping with 4 or 5 men a day, $60 to $100 a pop, but they didn't get any of the money.
While they're servicing the men, Genet embraces her role as enforcer, waiting in the bathroom to make sure everything goes as planned.
Well, Genet would follow whatever instruction McKinley gave her. If McKinley said to go slap the girl to keep her on the line, she would do it.
Genet was on the team. She was willing to do whatever she needed to do for McKinley to be happy, for their business to be successful.
Because McKinley basically views the other women in the house as slaves, Genet was manipulated into thinking the same way, almost identifying with the aggressor, because she felt that he had saved her from a life of peril on the streets and owed that to him.
Together, they hold as many as 8 girls at a time against their will. McKinley does whatever it takes to keep them in line.
I would start yelling at them. When the yelling wasn't giving him the response that he needed, then hitting them was the next step. And that progressed all the way up to putting a gun to their head. One of the punishments he would do to them is put a gun to the side of their head and dry fire the gun.
They don't know if there's bullets in the chamber or what. But just imagine what that must have been like for these women. They didn't know if they were going to die locked up in this room.
For 3 years, their sex trade operation runs like a well-oiled machine, with McKinley at the helm and Genet by his side. The partnership is so strong, she even asks for a special ceremony.
I don't know if it was legal wedding, but Genet wanted to get married, so it's a reassurance that he wasn't going to give rid of her, that he was going to keep her forever.
Then late one night that summer, Genet takes her loyalty to her new husband one step further. While 2 of their girls are resting in between Johns inside the efficiency, Daddy lets his guard down and forgets to lock their door.
He had fallen asleep. 2 of his captive women, Angel and Diamond, were there. They were awake. They chose that opportunity as a time to get some pills that they both wanted to take.
They sneak back to their room, but don't exactly cover their tracks. As soon as McKinley wakes up and sees his stash missing, there are only 2 possible culprits. Furious, he grabs the girls.
He called Genet. The 4 of them got into the car. The 2 captive women didn't know what was going on.
They drive down a dark, secluded street and arrive at an abandoned house. He orders his wife to discipline the girls.
Teach these girls a lesson.
Come on, get out.
Genet got Angel out of the car, took her into the house.
McKinley keeps Diamond in the car with him and waits. Inside the abandoned house, according to Angel, the enforcer beats her with her bare hands.
She ended up knocking one of her teeth out.
The behavior was escalating. There's only a finite time before something goes wrong.
She then wraps her hands around Angel's neck.
She was saying to her repeatedly, "Why did you disrespect Daddy?"
You think you want to disrespect Daddy?
Next to California and Texas, Florida has the 3rd highest rate of reported sex trafficking cases per year in the United States.
We average about 400 cases. There's a very diverse population here, people who come from all over the world.
Many of the women and children involved as the victims come from the Caribbean, come from South America. They're down on their luck and therefore become at risk for these sexual predators. And it's a very serious problem.
Girls a lesson.
In Hollywood, Florida, Genet Rembert is the enforcer in a prostitution ring. After beating down Angel, one of the girls that she and her husband, McKinley, Daddy Desir, hold captive, she wraps her hands around the girl's throat.
She ended up choking her into unconsciousness. And by the time the woman came to, They were on their way back to the car.
Genet then grabs their other captive, Diamond, and drags her into the house for her beating.
Meanwhile, Daddy told her to put her head down, and he's blasting her and telling her, "You better be glad that we didn't kill you."
The message is received.
But the threats they did to these girls was to let them know that if they didn't comply with what they wanted them to do, there were consequences, up until death.
Genet is so brainwashed by McKinley that she becomes an extension of him, and she does whatever he asks her to do, no questions asked. She wanted to show him that she was completely on his side.
Genet has never been a violent person, but when she got with McKinley, he hardened her. He made her someone she's not.
While this husband and wife team keep their girls in line, the Boynton Beach police are closing in. They have uncovered the online escort service ads that Genet has been posting and set up a sting operation.
We responded to an ad, and it was for a two-girl special. We had an undercover officer posed as a John, staying at a hotel. We had surveillance teams in place.
Genet and one of their girls show up to the motel room.
You could see that Genet was clearly in control of the conversation and what was going down. They discussed what sex act they were going to do and how much money it was.
With the deal in place, police swarm the hotel room and arrest both women. They're hauled down to the station for questioning. Genet is first up. During the sting, it was obvious she's the one in charge.
It became pretty clear to the police that Genet was the one behind those ads.
The hardened enforcer is calm and cool. She refuses to give up any details of their operation, including her husband.
She was loyal. I asked her if anybody else was involved in it. She said solely herself.
But the other girl is visibly shaken. Seeing a chance to finally wake up from this nightmare, she tells investigators everything she knows about Genet and McKinley. As the girl talks, it becomes clear to police that this is more than just a simple prostitution case. And apparently, they aren't the only ones interested in the Haitian pimp.
We were contacted shortly after by the FBI, who, unbeknownst to us, was also working a case on McKinley. And we got together and spoke about my case and their cases.
The FBI have spoken with another victim that backs up all the claims against Genet and her daddy.
One of the girls who was being held hostage in McKinley's apartment got a hold of his phone and texted her mother about what was happening. So that fact, coupled with what happened with the arrest in the hotel room, is making it pretty clear to the authorities that there is a sex ring happening here.
Genet's instantly arrested and charged with sex trafficking. Realizing she's caught, she finally comes clean.
This agent got her to see the severity of the situation she was in. And so Genet, understanding and realizing that, knew that she really had no choice but to turn against McKinley.
I was just totally taken aback because I didn't know she was this far in. I didn't know she had became this person, and it was just so sad.
Investigators immediately hunt down McKinley outside of their home and also arrest him for sex trafficking. Although multiple women were victimized, only 2 are courageous enough to speak out. That spring, husband and wife go to trial and plead not guilty. McKinley Desir is convicted of 1 count of conspiracy to commit sex trafficking and 2 counts of sex trafficking by force, threats, fraud, or coercion, and is sentenced to life in prison.
Genet got convicted of 1 count of conspiracy of committing sex trafficking. She got 15 years for her role in trafficking these girls.
The 21-year-old now understands that her desperation to be part of a family and find love made her vulnerable to the likes of McKinley. She spends her time preparing for the day she will be released.
I understand that in prison she is thriving, she's getting some education, she feels true remorse for what she's done.
She's mentoring those.
The freezing rain of March 2003 did not just slick the historic brick pathways of Boston's Beacon Hill. It washed over a devastating betrayal that would lock itself into the structural landscape of the city for over 2 decades. It began with an unnatural, suffocating silence radiating from a brownstone apartment on quiet Pinckney Street, an upscale, historic neighborhood where gas lamps and polished brass door knockers promised a picture-perfect sanctuary for Boston's elite young professionals. 23-year-old medical researcher Claire Brooks had chosen this quiet historic district precisely for its unassailable safety records, an urban enclave where residents walked their dogs at midnight without fear and recognized every face on the block. But on the raw morning of March 14th, that comforting domestic illusion shattered into cold fragments, replaced by a brutal enigma that would carve a permanent scar into the psychological fabric of New England. The grim discovery was made by her landlord arriving to check a reported water leak, expecting to find a loose pipe filter, but instead encountering a slightly unlatched heavy oak door that allowed the sharp, metallic odor of fresh blood to drift out into the chilly hallway. When the initial responding patrol units crossed that threshold, they stepped directly into a horrific, hyper-focused crime scene that forced veteran officers to halt in pure disbelief, realizing instantly that an aggressive human predator had bypassed the secure structural perimeter like an invisible, absolute phantom. Claire Brooks lay completely still across the polished hardwood floor of her living room, her exceptionally promising future violently terminated not by a chaotic, random break-in or an opportunistic theft, but by a series of precise, microsurgical injuries that indicated a chilling level of physical dominance and cold control. The living room remained an unsettling, frozen tableau of an interrupted intellectual life. An open biology journal sat on the side table, an untouched mug of tea had gone cold near her laptop, and a single, crushed artifact lay near the entryway, carrying the invisible biological signature of an executioner who left absolutely no signs of forced entry, no shattered window panes, and no traditional forensic trace material. Homicide investigators swarmed the brownstone within minutes, stringing bright yellow police tape across the historic iron railings as terrified, pale-faced neighbors gathered on the sidewalks under the bleak morning sun, their minds completely paralyzed by a sudden, pulsing shockwave, because this was a secure zone populated by doctors, state attorneys, and university professors. The absolute lack of structural damage or defensive disruption suggested an agonizing operational reality from the very first hour. The victim had recognized her assailant, trusted their presence completely, and unlocked her secure perimeter without a single cry for help or a defensive struggle. Forensic teams combed every square millimeter of the residence, bagging hair fibers, indexing faint smudges, and securing a unique, partially burned cardboard matchbook from the hallway floor, a seemingly minor piece of waste that would silently hold the killer's genetic profile through 23 years of bureaucratic, climate-controlled storage and radical technological evolution. In the immediate aftermath of the slaughter, the Boston Police Department launched one of the most resource-heavy, aggressive investigations in the city's modern history, interviewing hundreds of college associates, establishing checkpoints along Starrow Drive, and pursuing a vast suspect matrix that grew increasingly chaotic with every passing week. Detectives worked brutal, nonstop shifts fueled by bad diner coffee and public outrage, filling massive steel cabinets with tip sheets that ultimately dissolved into agonizing dead ends as every promising lead collapsed under closer, empirical scrutiny. The initial suspect rosters were a frustrating, exhausting cycle of false alarms and shattered theories, an eccentric lab assistant seen arguing with Claire at a research symposium days prior who possessed an ironclad, verified out-of-state alibi, a volatile former tenant with a history of property disputes who passed multiple polygraph examinations, and a suspicious individual spotted near the local transit station who vanished into the metropolitan underbelly without a trace. As the months bled into agonizing years, the frantic, high-velocity energy of the initial manhunt calcified into a heavy, permanent despair that settled deeply over the Brooks family and the rotating roster of frustrated detectives assigned to the cold case file. The thick leather binders containing the investigative reports grew heavy with dust, relegated to the deepest corners of the Unsolved Crimes Archive vault, a classic cold case defined by an absolute operational stalemate that resisted human intuition and traditional investigative methodologies. The profound shock of the young researcher's death permanently altered the cultural fabric of a neighborhood, turning a trusting urban paradise into a fortress of intense paranoia where parents kept their children permanently indoors, neighbors viewed each other with quiet, unvoiced suspicion, and front doors were locked with reinforced deadbolts even during the brightest hours of the day. The case became a legendary ghost story discussed in hushed tones over police scanners, an untouchable enigma defined by a single, teasing strand of biological evidence that held all the answers but possessed no identity until science finally caught up with a killer's supreme, untouchable arrogance. The unprecedented breakthrough did not originate from a sudden deathbed confession, a rogue tip line, or a breakdown in the suspect's psychological composure. It emerged from the quiet, relentless development of advanced automated forensic genomics and modern investigative genetic genealogy in the early months of 2026. A newly appointed cold case task force, systematically auditing the archive vault for biological residue that had been classified as unidentifiable or insufficient under early 2000 standards, pulled the Brooks evidence container from its decades of darkness. Utilizing a newly developed multispectral digital sequencing process that maps billions of genomic markers from highly degraded or microscopic samples, laboratory specialists extracted a flawless, pristine genetic profile from the dried cellular material left on the partially burned cardboard matchbook. When this digitized biological signature was uploaded into the National Familial DNA Database, the algorithms did not point to a known violent offender, a repeat felon, or a transient predator. The data tree converged with mathematical precision onto a highly insular local lineage, narrowing down the branch names until it locked onto a profile that sent a wave of absolute, paralyzing disbelief through the district attorney's office. The DNA belonged to 44-year-old Marcus Vance, a highly respected, affluent local architect, Claire's high school sweetheart, the very man who had stood at the center of the primary grief circle in 2003, holding her mother's hand at the funeral and publicly weeping over the tragic loss of his first love. The revelation that a respected professional who had spent the last 23 years living as a symbol of civic grace and enduring grief was the cold-blooded monster who had slaughtered Claire Brooks created an immediate, high-stakes operational emergency for the Boston Police Command. Detectives quickly initiated a top-secret, round-the-clock surveillance operation, tracking the architect through his quiet suburban routines to confirm his physical status and ensure he had absolutely no opportunity to destroy personal records or flee the jurisdiction before a capital murder warrant could be officially executed. The covert tracking team watched Marcus Vance for 72 hours, recording his movements as he drove his luxury vehicle through the local suburbs, chatted warmly with active-duty municipal officials at a historical preservation society event, and sat on his porch reading the morning news, a public facade of absolute, institutional innocence that masked the chilling mind of a calculated sociopath. The district attorney signed the historical arrest warrant in absolute secrecy, selecting a quiet Tuesday morning to spring the trap outside his suburban home to minimize the risk of a public disturbance or danger to the neighborhood. As Vance stepped out onto his asphalt driveway holding a leather briefcase, 3 unmarked black SUVs swerved onto the curb, boxing him in completely as heavily armed tactical officers emerged with weapons drawn and commands echoing off the suburban walls. The total transition from respected citizen to accused capital murderer took less than 5 seconds. The heavy silver handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists as the formal warrant from March 2003 was read aloud into the crisp morning air over the roar of passing highway traffic. The look that crossed Marcus Vance's face in that definitive, shattering moment was not one of righteous confusion or explosive indignation, but a sudden, deathly paleness, a complete emptying of the eyes as he looked down at the tactical boots on his lawn and realized that the microscopic ghost he left behind 23 years ago had finally bypassed the passage of time. The subsequent press conference at Boston Police Headquarters was a massive media circus that drew national attention, a cathartic explosion of historical data that finally answered the questions that had tormented the city for a generation. The chief of police stood before a dense wall of microphones, his voice heavy with profound emotion as he displayed the modern mugshot of the architect next to the faded, beautiful photograph of young Claire Brooks, a stark visual contrast that brought tears to the eyes of retired officers who sat in the front row of the briefing room. The community gasped as the details of the genetic match were laid bare, forever changing the public's understanding of cold case limitations and proving that no criminal could rely on the protective shield of a respectable career or the deterioration of time to erase their biological footprint. The echoing click of the heavy iron door closing behind Marcus Vance inside the high-security processing facility signaled the opening salvo of a complex legal and psychological warfare that would push the Massachusetts judicial system to its absolute limits. As the architect was stripped of his premium civilian garments and forced into the standard-issue orange uniform, the public unraveling of his double life initiated a profound cultural earthquake across the state. Investigators immediately executed sweeping search warrants on his suburban residence, discovering a hidden wall safe behind his collection of professional commendations that contained a chilling archive of old high school yearbooks, personal journals documenting Claire Brooks' daily routines in 2003, and a collection of historical mementos that had been completely scrubbed from his public persona. The local media operated in a state of hyper-frenzied analysis, running daily retrospectives that dissected how a lead mourner could carry a horrific slaughterhouse in his memory while actively participating in the daily life of the community he had systematically deceived. Vance retained a high-powered defense consortium, a group of aggressive corporate attorneys who specialized in tearing ancient chain-of-custody protocols to shreds and mounting fierce constitutional challenges against the use of modern genetic mapping on decades-old evidence. The prosecution worked around the clock to reinforce their forensic foundation, knowing that the defense would aggressively exploit Vance's historical local standing and calm, professional appearance to plant seeds of sympathy and reasonable doubt in the minds of a jury panel. Detectives tracked down former classmates and estranged acquaintances from Vance's university years in the early 2000s, uncovering a dark, hidden history of volatile possession, intense personal obsessions, and vindictive behaviors that had been successfully covered up by his family's immense social influence. The motive that emerged from these ancient human memories was one of pure, narcissistic dominance. Vance had become enraged when Claire attempted to permanently sever their high school connection to pursue her medical career independently, an insult to his fragile, untouchable ego that he chose to avenge with tactical, cold-blooded cruelty. The defense team launched their opening legal counteroffensive during the pretrial hearings, filing massive motions to suppress the DNA evidence by arguing that the cardboard matchbook had been improperly handled and documented during the chaotic processing of the original crime scene, suggesting that Vance's genetic material could have been deposited through routine, legitimate domestic contact prior to the murder rather than during the commission of the crime. The lead prosecutor countered this wave of high-priced defensive rhetoric by bringing the state crime lab's chief forensic genomicist to the stand, systematically documenting the unbroken chain of custody that had protected the evidence matchbook for 23 years. The specialist utilized detailed, archived storage logs to prove that the delicate paper item had remained sealed within a tamper-evident, climate-controlled vault since the exact hour it was secured from the hallway floor, completely neutralizing any theory of modern laboratory contamination or environmental degradation. Furthermore, the expert explained to the court that the specific cellular density and distribution pattern extracted from the matchbook proved with mathematical certainty that the DNA was deposited through direct, high-pressure friction concurrent with the lighting of the match left at the scene, rendering the defense's theory of casual historical transfer a functional impossibility. When the Superior Court judge finally ruled that the modern genetic evidence was fully admissible under Massachusetts law, a palpable shockwave traveled through the defense table, stripping Marcus Vance of his primary social shield and exposing his hidden past to the unyielding light of a public trial. The selection of the jury became an agonizingly slow, deliberate process, as hundreds of prospective jurors were systematically vetted to ensure they could separate the respected archetype of a local architect from the clinical reality of the forensic evidence. As the first morning of the formal trial dawned, the courtroom was a pressure cooker of anticipation, the gallery packed to maximum capacity with national journalists, legal scholars, and emotional onlookers who had followed the case since its inception in 2003. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury box, his expression grim but anchored by an unshakable confidence as he projected a massive image of the old cardboard matchbook onto the display screen, letting the digital artifact sit before the panel as an unyielding monument to the truth. For 23 years, the prosecutor's voice boomed through the courtroom speakers, cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. The man sitting right there used a shield of public grief, professional success, and shared history to hide an act of unspeakable, calculated depravity. He thought that because the calendar pages turned, because the city expanded, and because the original evidence boxes sat in the dark, he had successfully executed a perfect, permanent escape from his own savagery. He traced the trajectory of the genetic evidence, masterfully demonstrating how a single, involuntary transfer of biological cells on a common matchbook had created an indestructible link that traveled across more than 2 decades of human history to lock around the defendant's neck. The defense team launched a ferocious counterattack during their presentation, attempting to exploit the physical elegance and professional composure of their client by presenting him as a dedicated, peaceful man who was being actively victimized by a desperate police department eager to resolve an embarrassing cold case at any cost. They brought forward character witnesses from the local architectural and historical preservation communities who spoke highly of him on the stand, describing Marcus as a visionary professional who had designed iconic spaces for Boston, arguing that it was a psychological impossibility for a devoted childhood sweetheart to commit the very atrocity he had publicly mourned for decades. The defense attorneys ruthlessly grilled the surviving 2003 responding technicians on cross-examination, exposing minor inconsistencies in their decades-old field notes and attempting to paint the original, primitive investigation as a rushed, incompetent operation that had ignored alternative leads in their haste to secure a narrative. But the prosecution systematically neutralized this strategy, introducing the physical evidence recovered from the hidden wall safe, the archived personal journals mapping Claire Brooks' daily movements, and the old digital logs from Vance's private computer from 2003 that documented his frantic monitoring of the police investigation immediately following the murder. The emotional climax of the trial arrived when the prosecution called Claire's surviving mother to the stand, a moment so laden with psychological tension that a dead, absolute silence settled over the room as the elderly woman looked across the well of the courtroom at the identical man who had once held her hand and wept openly at her daughter's funeral. The mother spoke with a halting, heartbreaking clarity that brought a profound gravity to the wood-paneled room, describing the exact sequence of events that led her to receive the terrifying phone call on that freezing March day. She recounted how the shadow of that afternoon had completely demolished her family's reality, turning their subsequent decades into a permanent museum of unresolved grief, while the monster responsible lived a life of public respect and professional comfort, watching their suffering with a hidden, untouchable grin from behind his architectural blueprints. As she spoke, she demanded that Marcus Vance look at her, but the defendant remained chillingly detached, his eyes fixed strictly on his own hands resting on the defense table, his posture reflecting the absolute emotional void of a natural-born predator who felt no connection to the human collateral of his choices. The closing arguments were delivered on a gray, overcast afternoon that cast a somber gloom over the packed gallery, the air inside the room thick with the nervous energy of an audience that knew they were about to witness the final act of a 23-year tragedy. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury box one final time, his voice low and resonant as he raised his hand and pointed directly at the silent figure of the defendant. Marcus Vance thought he was smarter than the law, smarter than the science, and smarter than the collective memory of the city, the prosecutor stated with an unyielding intensity. He used his grief as a fortress and his charisma as a weapon, believing that the passage of time would wash his hands clean of the blood of Claire Brooks. But justice does not possess an expiration date in the state of Massachusetts, and the DNA he left on that matchbook was a biological contract that has finally come due. He implored the 12 ordinary citizens of the panel to look past the calculated facade of professional success and public sorrow and return a verdict that reflected the cold, empirical reality of the evidence. When the lead defense attorney stepped up for his final address, his approach focused entirely on the heavy burden of proof and the danger of relying on experimental forensic mapping to destroy an architect's remaining years based on ancient, circumstantial timelines. The state has brought you a terrifying story. They have brought you personal journals found in a private home, and they have brought you complex genetic genealogy testing that requires a science degree to truly comprehend, the defense counsel argued, his tone conversational, but laced with a desperate urgency. He walked slowly along the length of the jury box, looking each member in the eye as he reminded them that if they harbored even a single, reasonable doubt regarding the precise mechanism of how that DNA was deposited on that cardboard matchbook 23 years ago, their constitutional oath demanded an absolute acquittal. He concluded his argument by looking back at Vance, who sat perfectly still, before turning to the panel and whispering, "Do not let a tragic cold case lead to a modern injustice based on a science that cannot feel human doubt or honor a lifetime of civic contribution." Following a brief, razor-sharp rebuttal from the prosecution that reinforced the absolute statistical impossibility of the defense's environmental contamination theories, the judge read the final instructions to the jury, and the 12 men and women were led out into the deliberation chamber. The heavy wooden door locked behind them with a definitive click, signaling the start of the final, agonizing wait for a city that had spent more than 2 decades asking the same unanswered question. Hours bled into the evening, and the hallway outside the courtroom filled with a restless, anxious energy as reporters typed frantically on their laptops and members of the Brooks family huddled together in silent prayer. Marcus Vance was held in a secure cell beneath the courthouse, isolated from the world, left alone with the realization that his professional empire, his pristine professional reputation, and his carefully curated life could no longer save him if those 12 citizens chose to believe the voice of his own skin over the lie of his existence. Just before 8 p.m., a sharp buzzer rang out from the deliberation room, sending a jolt of pure adrenaline through the courthouse as the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a unanimous decision after less than 5 hours of debate. The news spread like wildfire through the city, drawing crowds of onlookers and camera crews back into the gallery, filling the room to its absolute breaking point within minutes as the atmosphere turned electric with anticipation. The heavy doors swung open, and Marcus Vance was led in by 3 armed deputies, his face still a tight, unreadable mask, though a sudden, involuntary tremor in his hands betrayed the immense psychological pressure crushing down on his composure. The jury walked back into the box in a single, solemn line, their expressions entirely serious, refusing to look toward the defense table, an ominous sign that seasoned court observers immediately recognized as the definitive harbinger of absolute condemnation. The judge asked the defendant to stand and face the panel, the silence in the room becoming so absolute that the sound of traffic outside seemed to amplify into a roaring cascade. The foreperson handed the official verdict sheet to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge for a final review before it was read aloud into the permanent record of the state, a moment suspended in time that carried the crushing weight of 23 years of waiting, searching, and bleeding. On the charge of capital murder, the foreperson's voice rang out clear and unwavering, cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. We find the defendant, Marcus Vance, guilty. A collective, shuddering gasp swept through the gallery, instantly followed by the muffled, uncontrollable tears of Claire's surviving mother, who collapsed into her relative's arms as the absolute finality of the words settled over the courtroom. Vance did not flinch, he did not cry out, and he did not look at the jury. He simply closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, his body turning rigid as the illusion of his perfect, untouchable life completely disintegrated into the dust of the courtroom floor. The Boston 2003 cold case was no longer a riddle, no longer an enigma, and no longer an unsolved ghost. The genetic fingerprint on a discarded cardboard matchbook had exposed the ultimate intimate threat, driving away the long, dark shadow that had hung over Pinckney Street for more than 2 decades. As the night fell completely over the Charles River, the light that shined on Claire Brooks' memory remained bright, unclouded, and entirely free from the presence of the monster who had tried to steal her world, leaving behind a solemn, historical reminder that the march of justice is unyielding and time can never truly erase the truth. The formal pronouncement of guilt inside the Boston courthouse did not mark the end of the Marcus Vance saga. It initiated a profound, post-trial reckoning that forced the entire architectural and social community to confront the structural rot hidden beneath its glittering history of civic service and professional prestige. As the silver handcuffs clicked into place for the final time, resecuring the wrists of a man who had successfully bartered a stolen identity for 23 years of absolute freedom, the focus of internal tracking expanded exponentially from a single historical crime scene to a comprehensive audit of his entire personal and professional life. The district attorney's office, flushed with a historic victory that redefined the global landscape of biometric forensics, immediately issued a series of sweeping subpoenas targeting Vance's active bank accounts and corporate transactions, determined to strip him of the remaining assets he had accumulated while living on top of an unresolved murder. The local media dedicated their evening broadcasts to a granular dissection of the verdict, highlighting how a discarded cardboard matchbook had held the key to the city's most infamous mystery, proving that no matter how deep a secret is buried under mountains of institutional pretense, the biological voice of the dead will eventually find its echo. The finality of the sentence of life imprisonment without the absolute possibility of parole ensured that Marcus Vance would spend his remaining years within the sterile, maximum security confines of the state penitentiary, stripped of his fortune, his professional credentials, and his elite social standing as a celebrated designer. He was removed from the county jurisdiction under heavy armed escort in the dead of night, transported toward the permanent obscurity of a concrete cell where his world would narrow down to steel bars and institutional discipline. The Boston 2003 cold case was officially closed, the intimate predator dragged into the light of ultimate accountability, leaving behind a community that had finally shed its collective armor. The brownstone apartment, which had sat for more than 2 decades as a silent monument to an unresolved horror, was eventually sold, its interiors completely remodeled to erase the lingering energy of the crime scene, the new owners planting fresh foliage where the dark shadow of a predator had once lingered. Yet, as the city found its peace, the lingering echo of Marcus Vance's decades of deception remained etched into the memory of the aging friends who had once trusted his character, a permanent reminder that the deepest evils can wear the most familiar, loving faces. The specialized task force that had executed the forensic breakthrough used the momentum of the conviction to establish a permanent genetic genealogy archive system, ensuring that thousands of other frozen files across the state of Massachusetts would eventually be exposed to the same unyielding scientific scrutiny. The binders of the Brooks case file, now thick with the added weight of the modern laboratory charts and the historic conviction records, were moved from the active desks of the homicide squad to the permanent archive vaults, their labels marked with a bright red stamp that read solved, a testament to a 23-year war that had finally run out of battles to fight. As the coastal wind swept through the historic corridors of the city, the silence that settled over the file was no longer the silence of neglect or despair, but the quiet, unshakable finality of an absolute verdict that left behind an enduring warning to every hidden predator waiting out the clock. The past cannot be buried deep enough to escape the light, and the truth will always find its echo in the unyielding march of justice. The transportation vehicle that escorted Marcus Vance away from the Boston courthouse did not merely relocate an inmate. It functioned as a moving containment cell for a completely shattered psychological facade. As the heavy transport van navigated the shimmering asphalt of the Massachusetts transit routes, moving past the architectural landmarks and civic centers that Vance had quietly designed or operated within during his 23 years of unearned freedom, the true, devastating depth of the post-trial investigation began to harden within the State Asset Recovery Division. Financial investigators and state agents had already initiated an exhaustive, line-by-line liquidation of Vance's suburban estate, dismantling the investment funds and corporate holdings he had meticulously protected over more than 2 decades. The 44-year-old sociopath had operated under the supreme, narcissistic assumption that his historical status as a talented architect, combined with his decades of carefully orchestrated public grief, would act as a permanent shield against any late-stage investigative interference. But as the iron gates of the state correctional complex loomed through the chilly night, the absolute futility of his professional pretense became an unyielding reality, his accumulated wealth systematically seized to create a permanent historical endowment for cold case genetic profiling across the state of Massachusetts. To fully comprehend the sweeping finality of this historic conviction, one must examine the long-term structural transformation that Vance's exposure brought to the Pinckney Street neighborhood. The historic brownstone apartment, which had sat for more than 2 decades as a quiet, heavily insulated monument to an unresolved structural crime scene, was officially purchased by a regional forensic advocacy network and slated for total interior deconstruction. The living room area, where 23-year-old Claire Brooks' internal biology had been violently terminated by a precise series of tactical injuries, was systematically stripped down to its framing, the structural elements scanned, indexed, and relocated to the State Training Academy as a permanent case study in domestic threat detection and advanced crime scene preservation. The surrounding city community, which had lived for over a generation under a heavy cloud of suspicion and unvoiced paranoia, experienced a profound, generational catharsis, the old, defensive habit of securing high-end entries during the daytime completely evaporating as the reality of Vance's permanent removal settled into the neighborhood's collective consciousness. Meanwhile, within the high-security diagnostic wing of the state penitentiary, Marcus Vance was introduced to the cold, automated, and entirely indifferent routine of an institution that cared absolutely nothing for his former status as a celebrated designer or a respected master of corporate networking. Strip-searched, fingerprinted using advanced multispectral digital arrays that contrasted sharply with the primitive early 2000s mapping of his younger years, and assigned an anonymous Department of Corrections sequence number, the killer sat on the edge of a stainless steel bunk, his tailored clothing replaced by the coarse, heavy fabric of a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. Institutional psychologists who conducted his initial mental health screening noted that his emotional baseline remained entirely unaffected by standard human metrics of remorse, grief, or personal accountability, his cognitive patterns presenting a textbook, unyielding portrait of clinical sociopathy wrapped in a changing frame. Vance spent his initial hours of total isolation not in reflection or despair, but in a state of hyper-focused legal calculation, using a blunt plastic golf pencil to scratch out endless notices of administrative appeal across sheets of standard prison paper, still firmly believing that his sharp knowledge of systemic leverage could somehow engineer a legal loophole to bypass the absolute mathematical certainty of his genomic match. The regional legal community analyzed the post-conviction filings with a specialized intensity, recognizing that the state versus Marcus Vance had established a permanent, unshakable judicial precedent regarding the admissibility of ancient biological evidence and the utilization of high-throughput genomic sequencing on degraded domestic substrates. Defense bar associations across Massachusetts issued comprehensive policy warnings, claiming that the ruling opened a highly dangerous slippery slope toward proactive genetic monitoring, where a citizen's historic presence inside a residential dwelling could be retroactively mapped through ambient epithelial cells preserved from previous decades. Conversely, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences hailed the conviction as a monumental milestone of empirical reality over chronological decay, proving that the individual markers of the human genome remain completely unalterable against the passage of multiple decades. The specialized state crime laboratory that had extracted the flawless genetic sequence from the smooth fibers of the discarded cardboard matchbook published a detailed technical profile in the National Forensic Registry, outlining the precise chemical amplification protocols that had transformed a forgotten piece of crime scene waste into an absolute, unyielding voice for a stolen life. As the heavy winter air of 2026 intensified across the coastal valley, the true, devastating impact of Vance's long-hidden double life continued to extract a heavy human toll from his surviving social circle, who were forced to re-examine 23 years of shared business deals, professional dinners, and neighborhood gatherings through the clarifying lens of his exposure. Longtime partners, local design directors, and high society personnel who had once defended his pristine reputation against historical rumors found themselves subjected to intense public scrutiny, their names forever linked to an elite domestic predator who had utilized their systemic trust as a structural defensive camouflage against law enforcement. The various community boards and professional organizations that had proudly displayed Vance's name across their member rolls and event photographs held emergency administrative sessions to systematically erase his footprint, pulling down archival listings and removing his images from public galleries in a frantic, collective effort to dissolve their institutional connection to the monster of Pinckney Street. Back inside the maximum security infirmary tier of the state prison, the harsh, unyielding reality of institutional life began to exact a rapid, irreversible toll upon the physical stability of the inmate, his body struggling to adapt to the complete lack of sensory variation and the rigid, mechanical schedule of his total isolation. The hands that had meticulously manipulated the crime scene on the Hill, leaving only a single microscopic error on a discarded matchbook, were now constantly trembling, the early stages of a progressive neurological decline accelerated by the intense, unmitigated psychological stress of his absolute loss of environmental control. Vance's eyes, which had once scanned the design boards of Boston with a cold, superior dominance from behind his executive desk, were now constantly fixated on the small rectangular viewing port of his steel door, waiting for a legal breakthrough from his defensive consortium that every legal mind in the state knew would never arrive. His high-priced corporate defense lawyers had quietly stepped away from his file following the Supreme Court's admissibility ruling, leaving his ongoing automated appeals to be processed by a public defender's office that viewed his past actions with a profound, professional disgust. The definitive finality of the 2003 cold case had achieved its permanent historical saturation point, a narrative arc that had transitioned from a terrifying, multi-generational urban legend of coastal horror into an absolute monument to human ingenuity and forensic devotion. The long, dark shadow that had hung over the city neighborhood for more than 2 decades was permanently driven away, replaced by the clean, quiet silence of an absolute resolution that left no room for alternative theory, romanticized pretense, or lingering doubt. As the night fell completely over the old stone courthouse, the vibrant urban landscape, and the concrete walls of the state prison, the light that shined on Claire Brooks' memory remained bright, unclouded, and entirely free from the presence of the monster who had tried to steal her world, a permanent reminder that while the march of human justice is slow, the mathematical certainty of the truth is entirely absolute and will always secure its definitive victory over the lie of a killer's life. As the weeks advanced toward the end of the year, the state's tracking units, operating out of a secure facility in downtown Boston, began releasing historical trace summaries that cast an even darker light on Vance's professional career. The computational data experts successfully unlocked an unindexed archival database folder buried deep within his old personal computer files, uncovering evidence of systematic tracking patterns that extended far beyond the primary homicide. The logs revealed that Vance had frequently utilized his high-level professional position to perform unauthorized background mapping on multiple young women and design associates who worked within his commercial networks during his most active predatory years. This harrowing digital pattern suggested that his elite positioning within the professional community was not merely a shield used to escape detection after a singular act of violence, but an active, weaponized scouting tool used to feed a deeply ingrained, narcissistic obsession with absolute social and physical control. The revelation sent shockwaves through the regional legal system, prompting independent oversight panels to begin the monumental task of auditing every single unresolved corporate disappearance and commercial legal dispute that Vance had ever crossed paths with, touched, or dismissed as an unprovable dead end. The profound cultural realignment triggered by this systemic exposure forced the active professional and legal apparatus to institute sweeping, permanent policy changes regarding the handling of historical executive evidence and the protection of internal corporate whistleblowers. The traditional, insular culture that had allowed a predator like Vance to manipulate forensic priorities and misdirect company investigators under the guise of seniority was thoroughly dismantled by an aggressive municipal reform mandate. New computational protocols were integrated directly into the state business and crime repositories, requiring immediate, automated internal flags whenever a high-level professional access stored company files or historic transaction records without an explicit, court-sanctioned operational assignment. This algorithmic safeguard was named the Clare Brooks Protocol, a permanent structural barrier designed to ensure that no wealthy figure could ever again use their professional leverage or authority to bury their own biological footprint within the chaos of an ongoing municipal investigation. While the legal and institutional machinery worked to scrub the city of his corrupt legacy, Marcus Vance's remaining associated connections retreated into an absolute, protective obscurity, issuing a brief, formal public statement through their legal representatives that completely denounced his past actions. They stated unequivocally that they would not contest the state's ongoing seizure of his commercial and personal assets, choosing instead to cooperate fully with the civil receivership to ensure that every available dollar was surrendered to fund the advancement of forensic genetic genealogy platforms. This complete structural abandonment stripped Vance of his final psychological lifeline, leaving him entirely dependent on the cold, state-appointed institutional framework that now dictated every minute facet of his rapidly dwindling existence. The decorated architect who had once commanded absolute authority within the city's most elite design circles had been completely reduced to a pariah, his physical remains and material history thoroughly rejected by the very community and family structure he had spent his life attempting to dominate through deceptive violence. In the dark silence of his medical isolation cell, the relentless hum of the automated monitoring equipment served as the sole remaining indicator of Vance's physical trajectory, his biological functions entering the irreversible, terminal phases of complete somatic shutdown. The voice that had once confidently directed major design operations and manipulated public narratives of grief was completely silenced, his throat paralyzed by the progressive neurological deterioration that left him unable to vocalize his escalating mental panic. He lay entirely frozen beneath the thin, state-issued sheets, a pale, trembling monument to the absolute futility of human arrogance when confronted by the unyielding, mathematical certainty of modern empirical science. The ordinary cardboard matchbook, which had spent 23 years hidden within a standard cardboard property box, had successfully fulfilled its silent, historical purpose across time, its invisible lines of genomic tissue having spoken with an authority that completely shattered the protective boundaries of his reputation, his corporate prestige, and the lie of his entire professional life. The relentless advance of the late 2026 autumn brought a sharp chill that swept across the concrete exercise corridors of the state prison complex, carrying with it the absolute, unyielding finality of Marcus Vance's permanent displacement from the civilized world. Behind the double-layered razor wire and the heavy, climate-insulated watchtowers of the maximum security facility, the professional prestige, the corporate boards, and the authoritative public appearances that had validated the rogue architect's institutional camouflage for more than 2 decades were entirely replaced by the cold, mechanical reality of permanent penal control. Vance was no longer the highly celebrated professional of the Boston sector whose strategic insight had masked a calculated malice. He was simply a numerical index cataloged within a centralized state computer database, a physical vessel moving through a sensory-deprived environment where every security gate was operated by a remote correctional officer sitting behind bulletproof glass. The rigid, commanding posture that had survived the intense scrutiny of a historic capital trial began to noticeably collapse under the repetitive weight of his new routine, his steps slowed by the physical toll of his middle years and the sudden, total evaporation of his professional autonomy. Inside the secure administrative offices of the district attorney, the technical victory of the guilty verdict did not signal a halt to the investigative machinery. Instead, it initiated a massive, cross-jurisdictional audit of Vance's entire historical domain. Financial forensic accountants and specialized major crimes investigators spent their days diving into the archived corporate records and private financial transactions of Vance's early career, systematically tracing every property acquisition, every unmonitored bank transfer, and every unauthorized information query he had filed in the immediate aftermath of the 2003 homicide. The state suspected that a personality capable of executing a 23-year-old researcher with such cold-blooded, tactical precision would not have confined his predatory impulses to a single night on the Hill. They uncovered a hidden pattern of aggressive psychological manipulation, including the systematic intimidation of junior staff, the unauthorized modification of transaction logs in unrelated investments, and the fraudulent suppression of private records, proving that Vance had utilized the exact same predatory, narcissistic methodology to maintain his pristine social standing that he had deployed to crush the life out of Claire Brooks. Simultaneously, the legal fallout from the admissibility of the 23-year-old genomic evidence continued to send profound shockwaves through the judicial landscape of the American Northeast. The Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court published a comprehensive, binding opinion outlining the legal architecture of the Vance conviction, officially cementing the utilization of investigative genetic genealogy and high-throughput sequencing on degraded domestic substrates as a standard forensic tool for all future cold case prosecutions. The ruling sent a clear, unyielding message to every hidden predator waiting out the clock across the valley. The passage of decades was no longer an absolute shield against accountability, and the biological debris left behind at a 20th or early 21st century crime scene could eventually be transformed into an ironclad legal noose by modern science. Criminal defense attorneys across the state held emergency symposiums to study the total destruction of Vance's ambient transfer defense, recognizing that the clinical precision of empirical data had completely revolutionized the boundaries of reasonable doubt in the eyes of modern jury panels. In the historic enclave of Boston, the physical remnants of the Vance legacy were systematically targeted for complete demolition and reallocation, a public cleansing of a name that had become synonymous with ultimate systemic deception. The suburban design firm properties that Vance had maintained during the height of his professional involvement had their structures stripped and their properties liquidated by state-appointed receivers to satisfy the massive civil judgments awarded to the surviving Brooks family. The funds generated from the sale of his assets were directly routed into a permanent municipal endowment designed to finance the high-throughput sequencing of unidentifiable biological evidence vaults, ensuring that his stolen wealth was directly weaponized to bring closure to hundreds of other families who had spent decades waiting in the dark for a forensic miracle. The human cost of Vance's exposure was particularly devastating for the aging associates and former colleagues who had spent years validating his prestige and accepting his professional guidance. Men and women who had sat next to him at major development briefings, shared strategies with him during complex designs, and defended his pristine reputation against passing rumors were forced to undergo intensive internal inquiries regarding their blind compliance with his facade. The realization that they had welcomed a primitive, unrepentant executioner into their private inner circles and used their own professional standing to protect his image left a permanent, bitter stain across the culture of the sector, transforming their former admiration into a deep, defensive campaign of absolute erasure. Back inside the maximum security medical wing of the state penitentiary, Marcus Vance's physical decline began to pick up a rapid, irreversible momentum, the harsh environment of the facility accelerating the onset of a progressive neurological condition. The hands that had meticulously manipulated the crime scene on Pinckney Street, leaving only a single microscopic error on a discarded matchbook, were now constantly trembling, unable to hold a standard institutional utensil without spilling the contents onto his coarse, orange uniform. Prison medical personnel monitored his status under strict security protocols, noting that his psychological composition had settled into a state of permanent, bitter paranoia, his remaining cognitive energy entirely spent on reviewing the historical transcripts of his trial and screaming obscenities at the public defenders assigned to handle his automated appeals. He was a man completely consumed by his own unraveling, left alone in a concrete box with the knowledge that his supreme intelligence had ultimately failed to outsmart the voice of his own skin. The definitive resolution of the Boston 2003 cold case had achieved its permanent historical equilibrium, transforming from a blind, terrifying legend of urban horror into an unyielding testament to the power of forensic evolution. The long, dark shadow that had hung over the piece of Pinckney Street for 23 years was permanently shattered, driven away by the clean, quiet light of an absolute verdict that left no room for alternative theory or lingering doubt. As the winter frost began to settle over the state, the light that shined on Claire Brooks' memory remained bright, unclouded, and entirely free from the presence of the monster who had tried to steal her world, a permanent reminder that while the march of human justice is slow, the mathematical certainty of the truth is entirely absolute. As the month progressed toward the darkest days of winter, tracking units working out of an auxiliary building expanded their digital tracing array to encompass Vance's historic communication logs from his final active years in the architectural market. Criminologists and digital forensic specialists successfully extracted an unindexed folder from a retired backup server that documented a sequence of highly disturbing interactions dating back to his university years. The digital footprint revealed that Vance had actively monitored the career paths and residential changes of several junior female students who had studied at local academies during his commercial peak. This harrowing discovery suggested that his manipulative behavior was not an isolated behavioral spike triggered by his encounter with Claire Brooks, but rather part of a long-term, structural practice of using his high-level credentials to survey and document vulnerable targets within the municipal system. The revelation prompted an immediate, independent oversight board to launch an absolute review of all historical harassment complaints and unresolved stalking files that Vance had ever crossed paths with, signed off on, or filed away into the administrative dead zones of the corporate archives. The cultural fallout within the wider professional and legal apparatus necessitated immediate, sweeping changes to the protocols governing the auditing of high-level evidence access. The historic practice of granting major designers unmonitored clearance to historical property lockers under the assumption of corporate loyalty was permanently abolished by a legislative reform mandate. Under the newly implemented system, any physical interaction with stored biological evidence from unresolved files required dual biometric authorization and an automated notification sent directly to a state-level judicial oversight panel. This strict operational check was officially integrated into the state code as the Claire Brooks Evidence Security Act, serving as a permanent mechanical barrier to ensure that no insider could ever again use their knowledge of corporate procedures to corrupt or suppress their own genetic trail. Simultaneously, the civil receivership tracking Vance's commercial investments finalized the total dissolution of his secondary architectural holdings, converting his remaining assets into direct liquid compensation for the victim's family foundation. The professional block that Vance had acquired through aggressive land partnerships in the mid-2000s was stripped of its identifiers, its high-end executive suites reconfigured into public training spaces for forensic genealogy researchers and legal aid clinics. Passers-by along the downtown corridor frequently paused to watch workers dismantle the signage that had once broadcasted Vance's financial success, recognizing that his carefully constructed empire had been entirely weaponized to dismantle the very type of systemic protection he had relied upon for more than 2 decades. Within the sterile environment of the prison infirmary, Vance's psychological state deteriorated into an absolute, uncommunicative stupor as the finality of his position broke through his remaining mental barriers. He no longer requested access to legal research materials or attempted to communicate with his remaining defense representatives. Instead, his daily existence turned into a silent, frozen loop of cognitive isolation. He lay beneath the institutional sheets, his eyes fixed on the cold light of the security monitors, his breathing becoming shallow and labored as his central nervous system began to surrender to the progressive neurological decline. The voice that had once commanded absolute authority during high-pressure situations was completely silenced, leaving him as nothing more than a historical anomaly, a celebrated designer unmasked as a baseline predator by the unyielding, mathematical precision of modern molecular science. The narrative arc of the 2003 cold case had reached its final saturation point, leaving no further paths for legal evasion, alternative explanation, or institutional distortion. The ordinary cardboard matchbook, which had sat undisturbed for 23 years within a dark cardboard evidence box, had successfully completed its historical mission across time, its invisible lines of genomic data having spoken with an authority that completely shattered the protective boundaries of his badge, his status, and his life. As the deep winter night fell completely over the coastal landscape and the urban center below, the memory of Claire Brooks stood fully vindicated, clear, and permanently detached from the shadow of her executioner, a definitive testament to the reality that the march of justice cannot be outrun by the turning of the calendar or the authority of professional prestige. The arrival of the freezing winter rains of late 2026 did not offer Marcus Vance a sanctuary within the sterile confines of the state penitentiary. Instead, the dropping temperatures turned his cell block into a cold, damp echo chamber that systematically dismantled the remaining fragments of his institutional ego. The 44-year-old inmate, once a highly celebrated figure of the Boston architectural community whose words could sway zoning boards and municipal committees, was now completely subjected to the unyielding, mechanical rhythm of a maximum security institution. His daily routine was stripped of every comfort and shred of authority he had accumulated during 23 years of stolen freedom. There were no tailored wool suits, no custom design studios, and no sycophantic professional associates waiting to validate his brilliant tactical insights. Instead, Vance's physical world was strictly bounded by reinforced concrete, a stainless steel toilet, and a narrow bunk where he lay for 23 hours a day, listening to the heavy, rhythmic clanging of automated iron gates and the distant, echoing shouts of ordinary convicts who populated the separation tier. Inside the secure, climate-controlled archive rooms of the Boston Judicial Complex, a secondary legal process was quietly unfolding, driven by a team of specialized appellate attorneys who had been retained by Vance's remaining corporate trusts before his assets were fully frozen by the state. These high-priced specialists were working around the clock to draft a massive, multi-tiered constitutional challenge against the validity of the guilty verdict, aiming to strike down the admissibility of the genetic genealogy and next-generation DNA sequencing that had sealed his fate. They argued in dense, complex legal briefs that the chemical suspension and molecular amplification methods used to extract the multi-pointed genetic profile from the 23-year-old matchbook constituted an illegal, retroactive search of a citizen's biological history, violating the baseline protections of the Fourth Amendment. They stood before the State Court of Appeals, painting the conviction as a dangerous product of technological overreach, warning that if a jury could convict a man based on ambient skin cells preserved from a previous era, no citizen's past could ever be considered secure from the prying eyes of the state. The prosecution, however, met this legal offensive with a cold, unyielding wall of empirical data and procedural perfection, refusing to allow an elite insider predator to buy his way out of a definitive capital murder conviction. The district attorney's office brought the original, retired property clerks and crime scene technicians back into the public square, presenting an unshakable documentation log that traced the physical movement of the cardboard matchbook from the exact hour it was recovered from the upper hallway floor on March 14, 2003, to the morning of its digital sequencing in 2026. This absolute continuity of custody proved to the appellate judges that the biological specimen had never been exposed to external contamination, degradation, or structural tampering, rendering the defense's theories of molecular distortion completely irrelevant under current scientific standards. The lead prosecutor argued with a quiet, burning intensity that the law did not possess a shelf life when it came to the savage execution of a 23-year-old researcher, and that utilizing the advanced tools of the 21st century to read the evidence of the 20th was not a violation of rights, but the ultimate fulfillment of the system's moral obligation to the dead. Simultaneously, the physical topography of Boston continued to cleanse itself of the Vance name, a public erasure that mirrored the absolute destruction of his social and financial status. The suburban property he had maintained on top of Claire Brooks' forgotten grave was systematically liquidated by state-appointed receivers, with every dollar in personal capital being redirected to establish the permanent Claire Brooks Memorial Fund for Forensic Advancement. This massive endowment was designed to provide free, high-throughput genomic sequencing and advanced biometric imaging to cash-strapped rural law enforcement agencies across New England, turning the very fortune Vance had protected through institutional manipulation into a permanent weapon designed to hunt down other hidden killers who believed they had outrun the clock. The design office, where Vance had lived out his professional career in absolute peace, was purchased by a municipal development authority, its interior stripped of its prestige to fund community outreach programs for vulnerable students in the valley, ensuring that his legacy would be defined by a permanent revolution in human justice rather than the hidden horror of his active years. The psychological toll of this total displacement became starkly evident during a routine psychiatric evaluation conducted within the medical unit of the prison, where Vance's cognitive architecture was shown to be entering a state of rapid, progressive collapse. The 44-year-old inmate could no longer maintain the fiction of his professional superiority. When the evaluating physicians questioned him regarding his baseline memory functions, he did not answer with his former sharp, media-trained eloquence. Instead, his eyes, bloodshot and frantic, fixated on his own trembling hands, his fingers continually tracing the invisible lines of his own skin, as if he were trying to rub away the very genomic ridge details that had betrayed him to the sequencer mapping arrays. He spent his hours pacing the narrow length of his concrete floor, muttering a fragmented litany of project specifications, historic design codes, and street names from the Boston of 2003, his mind completely trapped in a loop of narcissistic panic as the realization of his permanent oblivion finally breached his psychological defenses. Outside the prison walls, the surviving members of the Brooks family began to experience the first, quiet moments of genuine peace they had known in 23 years, their lives no longer dictated by the agonizing weight of an unresolved horror. Claire's silver-haired mother, who had carried the memory of entering that brownstone home on Pinckney Street since that freezing winter morning, visited the permanent archive vault one final time to view the closed file. She watched as the master technician placed the thick leather binders into the permanent section of the repository, a simple administrative action that carried the emotional gravity of a historic victory over chronological decay. The community of Pinckney Street, which had transformed itself into a fortress of deadbolts and paranoia during the winter of 2003, had finally shed its collective armor, the manicured brick paths and quiet sidewalks once again filled with the unburdened sounds of everyday life, entirely free from the lingering shadow of the authoritative phantom who had lived within their gates. The legal battle drew to its absolute, definitive conclusion on a gray morning in late winter when the Massachusetts Appeals Court issued a brief, unanimous decision rejecting Vance's petition for a new trial, officially declaring that the genomic evidence extracted from the old matchbook was legally flawless and historically absolute. The ruling effectively stripped Vance's remaining legal consortium of any further avenues of delay, cementing his sentence of life, without the absolute possibility of parole into the permanent framework of the state's penal history. There would be no dramatic courtroom exits, no late-stage appellate miracles, and no return to the polished desks of his architectural division. The rogue professional of the Boston apparatus had officially run out of options, run out of defenses, and run out of time, his identity permanently erased from the social registry of the city and reduced to a numerical designation stamped on a state prison file. As the night fell over the stone walls of the penitentiary and the cold rain began to wash the pavement of downtown Boston, the silence that settled over the Brooks case was no longer the silence of neglect or despair, but the quiet, unshakable finality of an absolute verdict. The ordinary cardboard matchbook, which had sat for 23 years in a dark cardboard box beneath the headquarters, had finished its long, silent mission, its invisible lines of epithelial cells and fluid lipids having spoken with a voice that completely shattered the protective power of institutional camouflage. The narrative of the 2003 cold case had achieved its permanent historical saturation point, a monument to human ingenuity and forensic evolution that left behind an enduring, chilling warning to every hidden predator waiting out the clock. The past cannot be buried deep enough to escape the light, and the truth will eventually find its echo in the unyielding march of justice. The structural finality of the appellate court's rejection did not just exhaust Marcus Vance's remaining legal options. It triggered a total somatic and psychological collapse within the high-security medical wing of the state prison. By the late winter of 2026, the cell block housing inmate number 035988417 had become a destination of quiet observation for specialized criminologists and state behavioral scientists who sought to document the final, desperate mechanisms of a predatory intellect stripped of its protective institutional camouflage. Vance sat on the edge of his low bunk, the coarse orange uniform hanging off his rapidly shrinking frame like sailcloth over bone, his hair unkempt, a housing dynamic that marked a pathetic departure from the immaculately groomed designer who had once dictated terms to major architectural units. The hands that had spent a career drawing complex blueprints, writing detailed technical logs, and signing civic donation receipts were now raw and locked in a permanent, high-frequency tremor, a physical manifestation of a progressive neurological decline that had been accelerated by the sudden, total loss of environmental control. Through the heavy steel viewing port of his cell door, guards monitored Vance as he engaged in a frantic, repetitive physical ritual that exposed the absolute disintegration of his rational faculties. He no longer utilized his plastic tools to scratch out convoluted notices of appeal across his remaining sheets of paper. Instead, his hands were entirely occupied with clawing at his own skin, his thumbs aggressively rubbing against his forefingers, as if he were trying to physically scrub away the very genomic fingerprints that had betrayed his location to the sequencing mapping arrays. He would look down at his fingertips, his bloodshot eyes wide with a mixture of narcissistic rage and primal confusion, whispering fragmented arrays of structural codes, old design blueprints, and residential addresses from the Boston of 2003. To the analysts recording his behavior, it was clear that Vance viewed his incarceration not as a moral consequence or a debt owed to the life of Claire Brooks, but as a technical glitch, a temporary anomaly, where the future had illegally breached the boundaries of the past to steal his perfect, unearned freedom from the system. Outside the iron gates of the penitentiary, the financial forensic liquidation of Vance's estate reached its absolute zenith, transforming the material remnants of his deceptive career into an active engine for public restoration. A state-appointed oversight committee finalized the complete dissolution of his primary design trusts, transferring the liquidated capital directly into the permanent operational budget of the newly constructed Claire Brooks Forensic Science Center in downtown Boston. The center, a state-of-the-art facility operating under the joint supervision of the State Bureau of Investigation and regional university laboratories, was designed to function as a high-throughput biological sorting house, utilizing advanced computational genomics and next-generation sequencing to process thousands of archived cold case files from across New England. The fortune Vance had protected by dominating the professional landscape of the valley was now systematically deployed to train young molecular analysts, ensuring that the legacy of his victim would be defined by a permanent revolution in human justice rather than the hidden horror of his past. Simultaneously, the suburban residence, the fortress, where Vance had spent his years watching the news broadcasts of his own unresolved mystery in absolute comfort, was completely cleared of its material arrogance. Demolition crews stripped the space down to its raw structural framing, removing the high-end fixtures, the custom interior paneling, and the manicured lawns to fund municipal housing initiatives for low-income families in the valley core. Passers-by frequently stopped on the pavement below, looking up at the empty framework of the home as the winter sun shined through the bare window frames, a profound and visible symbol of a community actively cleansing its topography of a monster who had believed his professional prestige made him immortal. The public erasure was absolute. His name was purged from the rolls of local charities, his portraits were removed from corporate halls, and his historical contributions to the architectural associations of Boston were thoroughly redacted from the city's official records, leaving behind nothing but a blank space where a decorated hero had once pretended to stand. For the surviving members of the professional and social circles who had once competed for Vance's strategic alignment and validated his prestige at exclusive local gatherings, the finality of the conviction forced a dark, defensive period of personal reflection and cultural realignment. Men and women who had spent more than 2 decades defending his pristine reputation against historical rumors were forced to confront the chilling reality that they had welcomed a primitive, unrepentant executioner into their private homes, letting him sit next to their children while carrying the physical secrets of a 23-year-old researcher on his hands. The collective trauma left a permanent, bitter scar across the trusting culture of the valley, destroying the old, naive assumption that professional honors, authoritative titles, and quiet domestic lifestyles were automatic indicators of moral stability. The neighborhood of Pinckney Street, however, embraced the resolution with a quiet, solemn dignity. The historic brick paths and quiet sidewalks once again filled with the unburdened sounds of everyday life, the heavy deadbolts and ambient paranoia of the last 23 years finally discarded into the dustbin of history. As the wet winter weather of Massachusetts gave way to the early intense cold of the late 2026 season, the operational reality of the prison machine moved forward with its characteristic, unyielding indifference to the physical decline of its highest-profile inmate. The prison medical staff formally transferred Vance to a single-occupancy cell within the infirmary wing, his progressive neurological condition leaving him unable to navigate the standard tier spaces or consume his meals without intensive physical assistance. He lay for hours on a high-railed institutional bed, his eyes fixed on the blank concrete ceiling, his breathing shallow and rattling as his body slowly succumbed to the crushing, sensory-deprived environment of his total isolation. There were no visits from former professional associates, no letters from remaining family members, and no legal updates from the public defender's office. The robe designer of the 2000s major architectural firms had been thoroughly and systematically forgotten by the very world he had spent his life trying to dominate. The definitive finality of the Boston 2003 cold case had achieved its absolute historical saturation point, a narrative arc that had transitioned from a terrifying legend of urban horror into an unyielding monument to forensic evolution and human devotion. The old cardboard matchbook, which had sat for 23 years in a dark cardboard box beneath the headquarters, had successfully completed its long, silent mission across time, its invisible lines of epithelial cells having spoken with a voice that completely shattered the protective power of institutional camouflage. As the night fell completely over the old stone courthouse, the vibrant urban landscape, and the concrete walls of the state prison, the light that shined on Claire Brooks' memory remained bright, unclouded, and entirely free from the shadow of the monster who had tried to steal her world, a permanent reminder that while the march of human justice is agonizingly slow, the mathematical certainty of the truth is entirely absolute. As the dark winter days stretched toward the close of December 2026, the institutional erasure of Marcus Vance reached its ultimate, unyielding milestone within the state record system. The data systems that managed the internal property divisions of the local county files updated their operational logs, marking the final corporate transfers complete and officially transitioning his remaining personal assets into the direct control of the Public Forensic Trust. This final act of administrative strip mining ensured that even the personal effects he had collected during his decades of stolen freedom, the custom design tools, the professional awards, the private property deeds, were thoroughly weaponized against the very criminal architecture he had built. The name Marcus Vance was completely scrubbed from the active registry of the city's professional planning database, his legacy officially terminated by emergency municipal declaration, leaving his memory entirely uncoupled from any institutional honor or public gratitude. Within the silent walls of the medical wing, the internal monologue of inmate number 035988417 grew increasingly frantic as the physical barriers of his condition locked him into a permanent, uncommunicative isolation. He could no longer lift his trembling head from the thin institutional mattress, his voice completely extinguished by the progressive neurological decay that stripped his vocal cords of their operational control. Yet, behind the unblinking, bloodshot eyes that stared uselessly at the cold light fixtures, his mind remained trapped in the geometric boundaries of the 2003 hallway, endlessly recalculating the precise placement of the cardboard matchbook that had destroyed his life. He was a prisoner not just of the concrete walls or the armed guards patrolling the exterior towers, but of his own microscopic mistake, a single, involuntary transfer of biological reality that had survived 23 years of societal changes, technological revolutions, and administrative shifts to trace his identity with absolute mathematical precision. Outside the facility, the local media had entirely shifted its focus away from the architect, the high-velocity energy of the trial having dissolved into the steady, quiet rhythm of post-conviction history. Investigative news blocks ran final, hour-long retrospectives that treated Vance not as a complex psychological riddle, but as a solved administrative problem, a structural security vulnerability that had been permanently patched by the integration of genetic genealogy into standard investigative protocol. The public no longer looked at his old blueprints with a sense of wonder, They viewed his exposure as a reassuring testament to the inevitability of empirical truth, a clear sign that the modern world had built an infrastructure capable of hunting down the most sophisticated insider threats. The brownstone apartment on Pinckney Street had been entirely restored to the architectural landscape, its interior converted into an open research library where students studied historical preservation, the ground completely cleansed of the heavy terror that had lingered there since the winter of 2003. When the night shift supervisors conducted their final security rounds through the maximum security infirmary on the evening of December 10th, they noted that Vance's vital signs had dropped to a critical baseline, his heart rate slowing to a sluggish rhythm on the bedside monitors. The electronic sensors continuously traced the collapse of his physical systems with a cold, digital indifference, logging each dropped metric into the central prison database, without human commentary or medical panic. The man who had spent his youth manipulating spatial designs and controlling human expectations from behind a polished desk was entirely alone in the dark, his presence reduced to a flickering green line on a standard medical display. There were no defensive maneuvers left to execute, no high-priced legal consortiums to file emergency injunctions, and no professional allies to bury the truth. The clock had finally run out on his 23-year alibi, leaving him face-to-face with the permanent, absolute reality of his own condemnation. The long, agonizing journey of the Brooks investigation had reached its permanent historical destination, a narrative that began with a horrific discovery in the winter frost of 2003 and concluded with the quiet click of a computerized medical log in 2026. The ordinary cardboard matchbook, preserved through decades of bureaucratic inertia by an unbroken chain of custody, had spoken with an authority that completely bypassed the turning of the calendar and the authority of professional prestige. As the cold air swept across the historic peninsula, clearing the remaining winter fog from the glass towers of downtown Boston, the memory of Claire Brooks stood fully vindicated, bright, and permanently free from the shadow of her executioner. The lesson left behind in the archives was absolute, a chilling and unyielding reminder to every hidden predator waiting out the clock across the nation. No reputation is thick enough to hide a biological signature, no decade is long enough to wash away the blood of a victim, and the mathematical certainty of the truth will always secure its definitive victory over the lie of a killer's life. The iron-laced security framework of the high-security diagnostic facility did not merely enclose the physical frame of Marcus Vance. It served as a brutal, sterile incubator for the total systemic destruction of his professional and personal camouflage. As the multi-locking mechanical bolt of his cell block slid into place with a definitive, hollow echo, separating the 44-year-old former architect from the frantic, high-stakes legal conferences taking place in the downtown corridors, the institutional landscape of the Boston Justice Complex transformed into an aggressive, unyielding machine of retroactive accountability. Under the raw, shadowless illumination of the intake processing tier, the highly calculated persona of the decorated, authoritative citizen completely dissolved, exposing the clinical, unrepentant reality of a calculated predator who had successfully bartered his reputation and corporate influence for 23 years of unearned freedom. The Major Crimes Bureau, acutely aware that this monumental genomic breakthrough would permanently challenge the constitutional boundaries of ancient evidence retention and professional manipulation, immediately deployed specialized units to freeze and seize Vance's comprehensive personal records, corporate logs, and private archives before his defensive legal architects could initiate a protective wall of injunctions. To fully dissect the sheer psychological and structural violence underlying this modern resolution, the observer must step out of the climate-controlled comfort of a 2026 sequencing laboratory and descend directly back into the freezing, paranoid atmosphere of the original 2003 homicide investigation. When the initial team of response technicians crossed the threshold of the historic brownstone apartment on Pinckney Street 23 years prior, they did not enter a standard, chaotic residential crime scene. They stepped into a meticulously curated slaughterhouse that bore the unmistakable signature of a highly disciplined, completely unburdened intelligence. Claire Brooks' final physical position was a devastating, unvarnished portrait of pure, localized domination. Her movement had been entirely neutralized by a physical force that possessed absolute, comprehensive control over the geometric spaces of the living room. The microsurgical nature of the anatomical trauma inflicted upon her frame indicated an explosion of cold-blooded, targeted malice, a deliberate assault that required intense, unflinching operational focus during its execution. Yet, as the crime scene unit of the early 2000s systematically dusted the hardwood floors with traditional silver nitrate formulas and primitive chemical vapors, they were met with an absolute, maddening forensic void. The executioner had operated with an almost supernatural procedural discipline following the assault, utilizing commercial-grade solvents to thoroughly strip down the heavy brass fixtures, the window latches, and the workspace surfaces, ensuring that not even the victim's own daily biological signatures remained to provide a baseline for comparison. The singular, monumental error in this otherwise flawless criminal erasure occurred right on the polished hardwood and tile floor of the front entryway, a routine, temporary transition point where the killer had momentarily dropped a common cardboard matchbook utilized during his dark tracking of the victim, depositing a microscopic, involuntary array of epithelial tissue and sweat onto the smooth paper edges before stepping back out into the icy Boston night. It was this minute, invisible biological smudge that would silently endure 23 years of bureaucratic storage, institutional relocation, and radical technological evolution, waiting within a sealed, dark cardboard canister in the precinct basement for the world's investigative science to finally catch up with the insider's supreme, untouchable arrogance. In the frantic, chaotic weeks immediately following the March 2003 murder, the Boston Police Department had been transformed into a suffocating pressure cooker, driven by a volatile cocktail of public terror, intense investigative media scrutiny, and massive political panic from municipal leaders who demanded an immediate arrest to protect the socio-economic prestige of the historic Beacon Hill enclave. Homicide detectives worked grueling, 20-hour rotations fueled by stale precinct coffee and raw, anxious adrenaline, compiling a sprawling suspect matrix that grew increasingly contradictory and unmanageable with every passing week. Because Claire Brooks had been a brilliant, highly visible medical researcher whose professional pursuits intersected with the city's academic elite, her daily social and professional orbits crossed paths with hundreds of individuals, ranging from low-level laboratory contractors to the children of high-ranking judicial officials. Investigators conducted over 800 structured field interviews, tracking down volatile former associates with verified out-of-state alibis, suspicious transit personnel who had been seen operating near Pinckney Street on the night of March 14th, and transient individuals operating along the commuter corridors. Every single promising lead, however, dissolved into a frustrating dead end when subjected to rigorous cross-examination. Timelines were validated, polygraph examinations were passed, and the complete lack of traditional physical evidence left the active homicide squad running in blind, exhausting circles. Marcus Vance himself had occupied a comfortable, entirely untouchable position of absolute safety during those early, panic stages of the inquiry, his name completely insulated from the original investigators' radar simply because his active status as a grieving high school sweetheart and prominent young architect shielded him from the casual, systemic suspicion of the street. In the spring of 2003, as a 21-year-old rising star within the local architectural sector, Vance had stood at the center of the public eye, actively directing design projects and offering artificial, calculated words of charity to local neighborhood associations. His deep, intimate familiarity with the internal mechanics of high society networking and municipal influence allowed him to systematically monitor the progress of the case from the outside, ensuring that any stray lead or anomalous report that threatened to veer toward his personal orbit was quickly rerouted, classified as unreliable, or buried beneath a mountain of alternative administrative priorities. His reputation for brilliant professional focus grew exponentially over the subsequent decades, his name eventually becoming etched onto the foundational boards of high-profile charities and regional development committees across Massachusetts, a multi-decade institutional shield that effectively placed his identity completely above the systemic suspicions of the criminal justice system. As the months bled into decades, the initial public fury of the manhunt calcified into a heavy, permanent despair that settled deeply over the surviving members of the Brooks family and the rotating roster of frustrated detectives who inherited the cold case file. The heavy leather binders containing the original evidence reports grew thick with dust, relegated to the back shelves of the Unsolved Crimes Archive vault, a silent, frustrating monument to the technological limitations of early 21st century policing. The primary piece of physical proof, the cardboard matchbook, sat undisturbed within its climate-controlled evidence locker, its invisible genomic data preserved against the decay of time by a strict chain-of-custody protocol that veteran property clerks maintained with religious precision. Outside the precinct walls, the city of Boston underwent a massive structural and cultural transformation, expanding its historic skyline and emerging as an international economic engine, but the dark stain on the Pinckney Street apartment remained completely unwashed, a hidden, pulsing wound in the city's collective memory. The catalyst for the ultimate resolution did not come from a sudden deathbed confession, a rogue tip line, or a breakdown in Marcus Vance's psychological defenses. It emerged from the quiet, relentless development of advanced automated forensic genomics and modern investigative genetic genealogy in the early months of 2026. A newly appointed cold case task force, systematically auditing the archive vault for biological and biometric evidence that had been classified as unidentifiable under early 2000 standards, pulled the Brooks evidence container from its decades of darkness. Utilizing a newly developed chemical suspension process that selectively amplifies highly degraded or microscopic samples from paper surfaces, laboratory specialists resubmitted the 2003 matchbook to an intensive forensic scan. The Advanced Sequencing Imaging System, operating at a resolution thousands of times greater than the primitive mapping of the early years, successfully pulled a flawless, multi-pointed genetic sequence from the porous fibers of the item, a biological signature that had been completely invisible to the human eye for 23 years. When this digitized genetic array was fed into the modern National Biometric Tracking Database, the system did not flag a career street criminal or a localized offender. It locked onto a historical profile that sent a wave of absolute shock through the district attorney's office. The data belonged to 44-year-old Marcus Vance, the celebrated, wealthy architect whose life of peace and prestige had been built on top of his young high school sweetheart's forgotten grave. The realization that a pillar of Boston society, a man who had spent more than 2 decades attending elite corporate events and receiving civic commendations, was the primitive monster who had slaughtered Claire Brooks, created an immediate, high-stakes operational emergency for law enforcement. The cold case unit immediately initiated a top-secret surveillance operation, deploying undercover teams to track the architect through his daily routines, ensuring that he had absolutely no opportunity to utilize his immense wealth or personal connections to flee the jurisdiction before a capital murder warrant could be officially executed in the light of day. The covert tracking of Marcus Vance lasted for 72 hours, providing investigators with a chilling window into the absolute emotional void of a natural-born sociopath who had lived for 23 years with a horrific murder buried in his memory. Undercover operatives watched the elegant, dark-haired professional push his grocery cart through the local supermarket, chat warmly with active-duty officers at a historical preservation society event, and sit on his multi-million-dollar porch reading the morning news, showcasing a public facade of absolute innocence that masked the chilling mind of a calculated predator. His public demeanor was perfectly serene, his smile warm, his posture reflecting the absolute composure of a man who believed his social status and elite reputation had purchased him a lifetime of immunity from the laws of ordinary men. The district attorney signed the historical arrest warrant in absolute secrecy, selecting a quiet Tuesday morning to spring the trap outside his suburban residence to minimize the risk of a public disturbance or danger to the neighborhood. As Vance stepped out onto the cold concrete of his driveway, leaning slightly to place a leather briefcase into the rear of his luxury vehicle, 3 unmarked black SUVs swerved onto the curb, effectively boxing him in as heavily armed tactical officers emerged with weapons drawn and commands echoing off the suburban walls. The total transition from respected citizen to accused capital murderer took less than 5 seconds, The heavy silver handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists as the formal warrant from March 2003 was read aloud into the crisp morning air over the roar of passing morning traffic. The look that crossed Marcus Vance's face in that definitive moment was not one of righteous confusion or explosive indignation, but a sudden, deathly paleness, a complete emptying of the eyes as he looked down at the tactical boots on the pavement and realized that the microscopic ghost he left on a discarded cardboard matchbook 23 years ago had finally bypassed the passage of time, the illusion of safety, and the permanent professional camouflage of his life. The resulting shockwave from this dramatic arrest rippled instantly across the entire state of Massachusetts, causing an immediate, chaotic collapse of Marcus Vance's architectural empire. Within minutes of the news breaking across digital platforms, municipal development boards and corporate compliance committees began locking down contracts associated with his firm, fearing the immediate legal fallout of a capital murder trial involving a lead designer. The district attorney's office, operating with clinical velocity, authorized emergency search warrants for Vance's secondary properties and executive suites, dispatching teams of forensic computer analysts to seize his historical administrative hard drives before his highly paid legal team could establish a barrier of data encryption. Under the flashing lights of the downtown precinct, the prominent architect was pushed through the processing lines, his custom-tailored garments replaced by the unyielding orange canvas of the state, his hands stripped of their expensive rings, leaving behind nothing but the stark, biometric reality of his matching genetic markers. As the morning papers hit the streets of Boston, the narrative of the tragic, mourning high school sweetheart was shattered forever, replaced by the chilling headline of a calculated executioner unmasked in plain sight. Legal scholars across the nation began dissecting the procedural mechanics of the genetic genealogy search, recognizing that the state versus Marcus Vance would become the defining constitutional battleground for the admissibility of historical evidence in the modern era. The initial defense team, composed of the state's most aggressive corporate litigation attorneys, immediately filed emergency injunctions to halt the liquidation of his assets, attempting to preserve his financial leverage for what promised to be an incredibly brutal, multi-layered defense campaign. Yet, behind the thick concrete walls of the holding cells, away from the design boards and luxury networking events that had validated his vanity for over a generation, the absolute isolation began to press heavily against Marcus Vance's psychological structure, forcing him to realize that the digital age had officially broken through the chronological fortress of his past. The heavy iron security doors of the high-security processing facility did not merely close behind Marcus Vance. They acted as a structural guillotine, severing his 23-year illusion of total immunity from the unyielding reality of the Massachusetts criminal justice system. As the 44-year-old former architect was systematically processed into the maximum security wing, stripped of his custom-tailored designer garments and forced into the standard-issue orange uniform, the public unraveling of his double life initiated a profound cultural earthquake across the state of Massachusetts. Outside the prison perimeter, the local media entered a state of hyper-frenzied analysis, running continuous live broadcasts from the steps of the courthouse while investigative journalists scrambled to unearth the hidden, dark foundations of his multi-decade residency in the historic neighborhood. Vance immediately deployed his accumulated financial savings and institutional real estate trusts to secure the services of the most ruthless, high-priced defense consortium in New England, a tier of corporate defense attorneys who specialized in exploiting microscopic legal technicalities and dismantling ancient chain of custody protocols. Yet, within the stark isolation of his cell, away from the design boards and luxury networking events that had validated his authoritative pretense for over a generation, the polished, calm composure began to fail him, replaced by a cold, calculating panic that bled through his eyes whenever the guards conducted their routine security checks. The prosecution team, operating under the direct supervision of the district attorney, knew that a genetic signature on a highly portable object like a discarded cardboard matchbook would face an incredibly ferocious challenge from the defense if it stood entirely alone. They immediately launched a comprehensive, multi-pronged investigation to build an ironclad circumstantial fortress around the genomic data, aiming to reconstruct the precise social and geographic matrix of the Pinckney Street brownstone during the freezing spring of 2003. A specialized team of cold case investigators was dispatched to scour the historical structural archives, utilizing ancient municipal documents, old employment records, and long-forgotten transit sign-in sheets to map Vance's daily behavioral patterns during the month of the murder. The picture that emerged from this deep historical audit was deeply disturbing, revealing that the quiet, respected designer had been engaged in a highly volatile, unauthorized surveillance campaign targeting Claire Brooks weeks prior to her death, an obsession that turned deadly when his high school sweetheart attempted to permanently sever their historical connection to pursue her medical career independently. An insult to his fragile, narcissistic ego that he chose to avenge with tactical secrecy. Undercover operatives interviewed retired precinct clerks who had remained in the city for decades, uncovering chilling, fragmented memories of an intense, aggressive possessiveness hidden behind his polite smiles and public professional commendations. Simultaneously, the defense consortium launched their opening legal counteroffensive, filing a massive, multi-page motion to suppress the DNA evidence, aiming to disqualify the 2003 cardboard matchbook before the case could ever reach a jury panel. They stood before the Superior Court judge during the highly charged pretrial hearings, painting Marcus Vance as a fragile, distinguished public designer who was being actively scapegoated by a desperate police department eager to resolve a high-profile cold case before the current generation of leadership faced retirement. The lead defense counsel argued passionately that a delicate paper accessory preserved for 23 years in a standard cardboard property box was inherently prone to environmental degradation, molecular cross-contamination, and cellular distortion, rendering the modern automated genomic sequencing platforms scientifically unreliable. They went so far as to suggest that Vance could have left his genetic material during his routine, legitimate domestic interaction with a victim prior to the crime, or that the item itself had been improperly handled and documented by the original, primitive forensic technicians who processed the front entryway floor on the morning of March 14, 2003. The lead prosecutor countered this wave of high-priced defensive rhetoric by calling the state crime laboratory's chief forensic genomicist to the witness stand, systematically establishing the flawless, unbroken chain of custody that had protected the evidence canister for 23 years. The specialist utilized detailed, archived storage logs to prove that the cardboard matchbook had remained sealed within a climate-controlled, tamper-evident vault since the exact hour it was secured by the original homicide squad, completely neutralizing any theory of modern laboratory contamination or environmental decay. Furthermore, the expert explained to the court that the specific cell density and distribution pattern extracted from the porous paper fibers, the precise configuration of epithelial cells and sweat deposits mapped by the next-generation sequencers, proved with mathematical certainty that the biological material was deposited through direct, high-pressure friction concurrent with the violent handling of the item. This scientific reality directly aligned the creation of the genetic mark with the commission of the crime, rendering the defense's narrative of casual historical transfer a functional impossibility in the eyes of empirical science. When the judge finally issued his definitive ruling, declaring the modern genetic evidence fully admissible under Massachusetts law, a palpable shockwave traveled through the defense table, stripping Vance of his primary professional shield and exposing his hidden past to the unyielding light of a public trial. The selection of the jury became an agonizingly slow, deliberate process that lasted for over a week, as hundreds of prospective jurors were systematically vetted to ensure they possessed the analytical stamina to evaluate decades-old circumstantial evidence without succumbing to the emotional gravity of the clinical toxicological and anatomical reports. The media encampment outside the courthouse grew into a small, structural city of satellite trailers and broadcast platforms, turning the downtown Boston streets into a national theater for legal scholars and true crime analysts who recognize the historic nature of the proceedings. Inside the crowded gallery, the remaining members of the victim's family sat tightly together, their faces pale and etched with the profound physical toll of a multi-generational nightmare that was finally entering its absolute, definitive arena. As the first morning of the formal trial dawned, Marcus Vance was led into the courtroom under heavy guard, his ankles chaining softly against the carpet, his eyes scanning the packed room with a cold, superior precision that showed he was still actively searching for a psychological advantage. The prosecutor stepped up to the podium for the opening statement, the room falling into a dead, absolute silence as he turned toward the jury box, raised his hand, and pointed his finger directly at the pristine, authoritative figure of the defendant. For 23 years, the prosecutor's voice boomed through the courtroom speakers, cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. The man sitting right there used a shield of public grief, professional success, and shared history to hide an act of unspeakable, calculated depravity. He believed that because the calendar pages turned, because the city expanded, and because the original investigators retired, he had successfully buried the memory of Claire Brooks beneath the weight of his architectural empire. The battle lines were officially drawn. The long journey toward ultimate justice had reached its final, dramatic arena, and the city of Boston waited with bated breath to see if the voice of an ordinary cardboard matchbook would finally seal the fate of an untouchable killer. The unfolding courtroom drama rapidly intensified as the prosecution began introducing its foundational witnesses, systematically rebuilding the physical environment of 2003 piece by piece for a contemporary audience that had no first-hand memory of the crime. The first individuals to take the stand were the surviving security and transit personnel who had operated near the Beacon Hill sector on that freezing March night. Now gray-haired or completely retired, these witnesses provided the jury with a raw, visceral entry point into the structural reality of the crime scene, describing the pristine, undisturbed nature of the apartment's entry locks and the absolute absence of typical tool marks or forced entry indicators. They testified under grueling cross-examination that the entry protocol had been uncommonly clean, suggesting a scenario where the victim felt zero threat when opening her primary door to her executioner. This established a critical pillar for the state's upcoming circumstantial sequence, heavily implying that the killer possessed an intimate familiarity and long-standing personal access that instantly disarmed the young medical researcher's natural vigilance. Following the initial responders, the prosecution called the retired property vault managers who had worked the initial collection details under the supervision of the early 2000s investigative team. This sequence was loaded with heavy, dramatic irony, as younger prosecutors used the historical field notes of these technicians to demonstrate how the defendant had actively monitored the processing priorities from outside the precinct through high-level social connections. The technicians testified that Vance's family representatives had repeatedly attempted to steer their attention away from the front entryway floor, where the cardboard matchbook was eventually cataloged, instructing them instead to focus their scientific tools on the rear window structures and alleyway exit paths under the false pretense of chasing a hypothetical stranger or an opportunistic intruder. This systematic misdirection explained why the matchbook had sat for decades without intensive localized processing, unmasking the defendant not merely as a cold-blooded assassin, but as an active, structural saboteur of the very investigation he had claimed to support through public statements of grief. As the second week of testimony commenced, the financial and digital analytics teams brought forward a complex web of archived transaction ledgers and private logs that illuminated Vance's behavior immediately following the crime. Forensic accountants demonstrated that within 72 hours of Claire Brooks' death, Vance had closed a series of unmonitored communication lines and scrubbed his internal project design files, a highly suspicious administrative cleanup that matched his knowledge of corporate oversight. Furthermore, old communication logs retrieved from the developer's ancient computing networks revealed that Vance had executed multiple unauthorized midnight queries into the victim's family history and medical research schedules in the months leading up to the ambush. The defense consortium fought desperately to block each piece of paper, painting the financial and computer metrics as fragmented, ancient coincidences that proved absolutely nothing about a physical act of murder, but the prosecutor anchored each document firmly to the timeline of the genetic evidence, forcing the jury to confront the reality of a calculated, multi-layered betrayal that had remained hidden for 23 years. The tension within the courtroom reached a critical mass when the prosecution introduced a series of high-magnification macro photographs displaying the cellular alignment on the matchbook's torn edge. The imaging clearly demonstrated that the epithelial cells matching Marcus Vance were embedded deep within the core structure of the fibrous paper layers, meaning they were trapped under intense mechanical force exactly when the match was struck and torn away from the booklet. The lead prosecutor stood directly in front of the defense table, holding the modern digital charts aloft so that the jury could contrast the empirical finality of the biological weave against the carefully curated, fragile expression of the defendant. This presentation completely dismantled the defense team's final lingering argument of post-mortem or casual environmental contamination, leaving the aging architect exposed as a clinical calculator whose meticulous personal planning had been entirely neutralized by the unyielding, mathematical precision of next-generation genomic forensics. As the court adjourned for the weekend, the dense crowd of journalists and legal commentators lingering in the hallways of the Boston judicial complex noted that the structural coherence of Vance's defensive strategy was completely disintegrating under the weight of the scientific evidence. No longer able to hide behind the abstract defense of chronological distance or casual transfer, his high-priced legal consortium spent the evening hours huddled in emergency strategy sessions, desperately seeking to formulate a psychological counter-narrative that could sway the emotional baseline of the jury box. But within the cold reality of the evidence locker, the ordinary cardboard matchbook remained as a silent, unalterable testament, an anchor across time that linked Marcus Vance directly to the violent termination of the life on Pinckney Street, ensuring that the upcoming phase of cross-examination would force him to confront the absolute finality of his unmasking. The presentation of the digital and molecular tracing on the fifth day of the State versus Marcus Vance transformed the historic Boston courtroom into a high-stakes scientific arena where over 2 decades of structural, material, and physical secrets were systematically laid bare before a spellbound jury. The prosecution called the Commonwealth's chief forensic genomicist and digital molecular analyst, a veteran specialist who utilized a massive high-definition presentation display to project a multi-dimensional digital rendering of the 2003 cardboard matchbook recovered from the Pinckney Street entryway. The courtroom fell into an absolute, breathless silence as the expert utilized a digital marker to map the high-density cellular distribution extracted from the porous paper substrate, aligning it with a statistical certainty that completely shattered the defense's narrative of casual, historic domestic contact. The specialist testified under oath that the concentration of epithelial tissue and sweat lipids extracted from the physical item matched the reference profile of Marcus Vance with a statistical probability of 1 in several billion, creating an ironclad genetic cage around the defendant that no amount of high-priced corporate defensive rhetoric could dismantle. The defense consortium launched a furious, hours-long cross-examination, attempting to rattle the veteran technician by throwing complex theories of laboratory contamination, thermal degradation, and historic storage failures at the witness box, but the scientists stood their ground like a concrete fortress, answering every aggressive query with cold, unshakable empirical data. The prosecution then shifted its focus from the clinical precision of the genomic data back to the raw, human devastation of the morning of March 14, 2003, calling Claire Brooks' surviving mother to the witness stand to anchor the abstract molecular science within the brutal reality of a stolen future. The mother, now an elderly, silver-haired woman whose eyes carried the heavy, permanent lines of a multi-generational grief, spoke with a halting, structural clarity that brought a profound gravity to the wood-paneled room. She described the exact sequence of events that led her to step into the brick brownstone residence on Pinckney Street on that freezing winter day, expecting to see her 23-year-old daughter reviewing her medical research journals, but instead encountering a scene of quiet, horrifying physical shock. She recounted how the sudden collapse of her daughter had permanently demolished her family's reality, turning their subsequent decades into a permanent museum of unresolved sorrow, while the killer responsible for the ambush lived a life of public respect and professional comfort, watching their suffering with a hidden, untouchable grin from behind his architectural blueprints. As she spoke, her voice breaking with the raw weight of an unwashed past, she looked directly across the well of the courtroom at Marcus Vance, demanding that the defendant look at the human wreckage his narcissistic pride had left behind. Vance, however, remained chillingly detached, his eyes fixed strictly on his own hands resting on the table, his posture reflecting the absolute emotional void of a natural-born predator who felt no connection to the human collateral of his choices. The database architecture of the state's case was further solidified when the prosecution introduced a series of archived personal files and internal corporate surveillance field notes recovered from the hidden wall safe behind Vance's collection of professional commendations. The digital forensics team had successfully reconstructed his historical log sheets, revealing that in the weeks leading up to the March 2003 murder, someone using Vance's private computing network had conducted intensive, highly specific research regarding the precise daily routines, vehicle movements, and private communications of the young medical researcher. This unauthorized investigative tracking perfectly intersected with the historical structural records documenting his predatory maneuvers to monitor her location, a boundary violation that had served as an intolerable threat to Vance's fragile, narcissistic ego when she discovered his obsessive stalking behavior and threatened a total, permanent break from their high school connection. The defense tried frantically to object to the introduction of these ancient computer files and handwritten field logs, arguing that the data integrity had been compromised over 23 years of storage and that the records were inherently unreliable indicators of a person's physical actions. The judge promptly overruled the objection, allowing the jury to see the precise, cold-blooded calculations that had preceded the violent ambush, a blueprint for murder that had been hidden behind his professional honors for more than 2 decades. The emotional climax of the trial's second week arrived when a surprise witness took the stand, a retired property vault manager who had operated the Central Evidence Facility in Boston during the early 2000s and had remained silent for decades due to a complete lack of context regarding the specific data tracking. The witness testified that on the afternoon of March 17, 2003, just 72 hours after the primary crime scene had been secured, Marcus Vance's family representatives had utilized his immense social influence to gain access to the inventory sheets of the Pinckney Street property boxes without standard administrative authorization, logging the query under a false corporate casing number. The witness presented the old, fading physical paper logbook bearing the signature of Vance's primary family contact, providing the jury with a direct physical link that tracked his proximity to the primary collection containers during the critical window of the initial investigation. This testimony was critical because it stripped away the defense's primary narrative of regular historical handling, demonstrating that the architect's focus on the physical evidence boxes was not an accidental byproduct of his role as a grieving high school sweetheart, but a deliberate, tactical procurement process executed to ensure his genetic trail remained hidden within the chaos of the municipal system. The local community remained absolutely gripped by the daily revelations pouring out of the Boston judicial complex, with modern television networks and digital true crime platforms broadcasting live streams that were monitored by millions of citizens across the state. The public fascination with a high school sweetheart cold case had transformed the proceeding into a massive cultural phenomenon, sparking deep societal discussions regarding the deceptive nature of institutional appearances and the terrifying reality that an executioner could live out a full, respected career in plain sight while their victim lay in an early grave. The city felt tightly wound, a palpable tension hanging over the cold concrete of the streets as citizens debated whether a modern jury would possess the analytical fortitude to convict a prominent, 44-year-old architect entirely on genomic evidence and circumstantial business records preserved from a previous era. The closing arguments were scheduled for the following morning, leaving the courtroom in a state of suspended animation as both legal consortia retreated to their respective war rooms to prepare their final, definitive appeals to the 12 ordinary citizens who held the scales of justice in their hands. When the courtroom doors surged open for the final phase of the State versus Marcus Vance, the atmosphere inside the gallery was thick with an electric anticipation, the space packed to its absolute maximum capacity with journalists, legal scholars, and emotional onlookers who had followed the mystery since 2003. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury box, his expression grim but anchored by an unshakable confidence as he laid the original evidence bag containing the cardboard matchbook gently onto the rail before the panel, letting the ordinary historic object sit there as an unyielding monument to the truth. For 23 years, The prosecutor's voice boomed through the courtroom speakers, cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. The defendant used a shield of public grief, professional success, and shared history to hide an act of unspeakable, calculated depravity. He thought that because the calendar pages turned, because the city expanded, and because the original evidence boxes sat in the dark, he had successfully executed a perfect, permanent escape from his own savagery. He traced the trajectory of the genetic evidence, masterfully demonstrating how a single, involuntary transfer of biological cells on a common piece of paper had created an indestructible link that traveled across more than 2 decades of human history to lock around the defendant's neck. He urged the jury to send a definitive, historic message to every hidden predator waiting out the clock that justice does not possess a shelf life or a boundary of time in the state of Massachusetts. The lead defense attorney stepped to the podium with a measured, deliberate posture, attempting to neutralize the intense emotional momentum of the state's closing narrative by shifting the jury's focus back to the abstract requirements of reasonable doubt and the danger of generational scapegoating based on experimental tracking techniques. He walked slowly along the length of the box, looking each juror directly in the eye as he argued that the state was asking them to condemn a respected professional to spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell based entirely on microscopic cellular debris that had spent 23 years bouncing through police storage lockers. They have brought you ancient municipal disputes. They have brought you old laboratory ledgers that prove nothing about actual physical intent, and they have brought you a genetic signature that could have been deposited on that cardboard matchbook during any casual, domestic interaction prior to that chaotic morning, the defense counsel argued, his tone conversational but laced with a desperate, structural urgency. He implored the panel to look past the media circus and the immense public pressure for closure, reminding them that their constitutional oath demanded an absolute acquittal if they harbored even a single, reasonable doubt regarding the precise mechanism of how that biological material was deposited on that porous paper substrate on the night of March 14, 2003. Following a brief, razor-sharp rebuttal from the prosecution that reinforced the absolute statistical impossibility of the defense's environmental contamination theories, the judge read the final, complex instructions to the panel, and the 12 men and women were led out into the deliberation chamber. The heavy wooden door locked behind them with a definitive, mechanical click that signaled the start of the final, agonizing wait for a city that had spent more than 2 decades asking the same unanswered question. Hours bled into the evening, and the hallway outside the courtroom filled with a restless, anxious energy as reporters typed frantically on their laptops and members of the Brooks family huddled together in silent prayer. Marcus Vance was held in a secure cell beneath the courthouse, isolated from the world, left alone with the realization that his professional firm, his pristine reputation, and his carefully curated life could no longer save him if those 12 ordinary citizens chose